Hello everyone, and welcome to Tales by Imon. Tonight, we delve into a mystery that blurs the lines between the world we know and a reality that whispers just beyond the veil of our understanding. Settle in as we begin a story I call The Phone Call from a Number That Doesn't Exist. The old house on Sycamore Street had always been a thing of quiet curiosity for Liam. It was a two-story Victorian, a relic from a time when horse-drawn carriages probably clip-clopped down the now asphalt-paved road. Its paint, once a cheerful canary yellow, had faded to a pale, buttery cream, and the intricate gingerbread trim was starting to show its age. To most of the town of Havenwood, it was just the Miller House, a landmark that had been there forever. But for Liam, a freelance audio engineer with an overactive imagination, it was a place of untold stories. He'd recently inherited it from his great-aunt Clara, a woman he'd only met a handful of times but whose letters, filled with tales of Havenwood's history, had captivated him as a child. Moving in had been a whirlwind of dust motes dancing in sunbeams and the scent of old paper and cedar. Liam had spent the first week just exploring, running his fingers over the carved wooden banisters and discovering hidden nooks and crannies. The house had a personality, a soul, he decided. It creaked and groaned like an old man settling into a comfortable chair. It was in the attic, amidst a sea of forgotten treasures, that he found the first piece of the puzzle. Tucked away in a dusty leather-bound trunk was an old, black rotary phone. It was heavy, a solid piece of machinery from a bygone era, its coiled cord still impressively intact. There was no modern phone jack, of course, just a strange, four-pronged plug he'd never seen before. Intrigued, he'd brought it downstairs, placing it on a small end table in his makeshift recording studio. It was a curiosity, a piece of history to admire. It wasn't meant to work. It couldn't work. That was why, 3 weeks later, when the phone rang, Liam nearly jumped out of his skin. The sound was jarring, a shrill metallic ring that echoed through the quiet house. It was a sound he'd only ever heard in old movies, a sound that had no place in his world of digital notifications and custom ringtones. He stared at the black phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was impossible. It wasn't connected to anything. He'd even checked the old wiring in the walls. It was all disconnected, severed years ago. He let it ring, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. It rang 10 times, each one louder and more insistent than the last, before falling silent. He cautiously approached the phone, his hand hovering over the receiver. It was just an old phone, he told himself. A weird electrical short, maybe. A fluke. He tried to put it out of his mind, immersing himself in the familiar comfort of his work. He was cleaning up the audio for a local band's demo, a task that usually required his full concentration. But the phantom ring echoed in his ears. He kept glancing at the rotary phone, half expecting it to burst into life again. The day passed without further incident, and as dusk settled over Havenwood, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Liam began to relax. He was being ridiculous. It was an old house. Old houses made strange noises. He made himself a sandwich and sat on the porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly ballet. The next day, it happened again. This time, it was late afternoon. He was in the middle of a conference call with a client, his headset firmly in place. The ring was fainter this time, muffled by the sound of his client's voice in his ears, but it was unmistakable. "Sorry, can you hold on a second?" Liam said, his voice tight. He pulled off his headset and walked into the living room. The rotary phone was ringing, its black, bakelite body vibrating slightly on the wooden table. This time, a strange compulsion took over. He had to answer it. His hand trembled as he reached for the heavy receiver. It felt cold, unnaturally so, against his ear. "Hello," he said, his voice barely a whisper. For a moment, there was only static, a sound like a distant, rushing waterfall. Then, a voice emerged from the crackle, faint and ethereal. It was a woman's voice, laced with a strange, melodic echo. Is anyone there?" she asked. Liam's breath caught in his throat. "Who is this?" he managed to ask. The static swelled, almost swallowing her words. I don't know," the voice replied, a note of confusion, of fear in her tone. I think I'm lost." "Lost? Where are you?" Liam pressed, his grip on the receiver tightening. "It's dark," she said, her voice fading in and out. "And cold. I see a sycamore tree." The line went dead. Not a dial tone, not the click of a hung-up phone, but a sudden, unnerving silence. The static vanished, and the receiver felt like just a piece of cold plastic in his hand again. He slowly placed it back on the cradle, his mind racing. A sycamore tree. He looked out his front window. A massive, ancient sycamore tree stood in his front yard, its branches like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. He tried to tell himself it was a prank. A very elaborate, very strange prank. Maybe someone had managed to tap into the old phone lines, a tech-savvy squatter who'd lived here before him. But that didn't feel right. The voice, it had sounded so real, so genuinely lost. That night, sleep offered little respite. He dreamt of static and a woman's voice calling out from the darkness. He spent the next morning trying to rationalize what had happened. He examined the phone again, tracing the disconnected wire with his fingers. It led to an old junction box in the basement, its wires cut and frayed. There was no logical explanation. His rational mind, the part of him that understood frequencies and sound waves, was at war with the part of him that had heard the fear in that woman's voice. He decided to do some research. He dug through the boxes of his great-aunt Clara's belongings, hoping to find some clue, some mention of the strange phone. He found old photo albums, stacks of letters tied with faded ribbon, and journals filled with her elegant, looping script. It was in one of those journals, dated nearly 50 years ago, that he found the first breadcrumb. Clara wrote about the house, about its quirks and its history. And then, he saw it. A single, chilling entry. The phone rang again today, she had written. The same lost voice. She asked for help. I don't know what to do. The number, it doesn't exist. Liam's blood ran cold. He read the entry again, and then again. His great-aunt had heard the voice too. The same lost woman. The same impossible phone call. The entry was short, and there were no other mentions of the phone in the journals that followed. It was as if she had decided not to write about it, to bury the memory. But for Liam, it was a revelation. This wasn't a new phenomenon. It was a part of the house's history, a secret it had kept for decades. Later that afternoon, as if on cue, the phone rang again. This time, Liam didn't hesitate. He snatched the receiver, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Hello. The static was there, a familiar hiss. And then, the voice. Hello. Can you hear me? It was clearer this time, less faint. Yes, I can hear you, Liam said, his voice steady. Who is this? My name is Sarah, she said. I don't know where I am. I was driving home. There was a storm. Sarah, Liam repeated, the name feeling foreign and familiar at the same time. Where are you calling from? There was a pause, and the static crackled. I don't know, she whispered. There's a phone booth, on a long, dark road. I can see a house, a yellow house with a big sycamore tree in the yard. Liam's eyes widened. He was standing in that house. He was looking at that tree. I'm in that house, Sarah, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I can help you. Where is this road? I don't know, she sobbed, her voice breaking. There are no signs. Just trees, and the rain. Please, you have to help me. The number. I just dialed the number on the phone. What number did you dial, Sarah? Liam asked, grabbing a pen and a piece of paper. She recited a string of numbers, and Liam scribbled them down. It was a local number, one that should have been in service. As she spoke, a strange feeling of déjà vu washed over him. He knew that number. He just couldn't place it. Stay on the line, Sarah, he said, his mind racing. I'm going to find you. But before he could say anything else, the line went dead. The silence was absolute. He stared at the number he had written down. He pulled out his cell phone and, with a sense of dread, dialed it. A recorded message, cold and impersonal, came on the line. We're sorry, it said. The number you have dialed is not in service. Please check the number and try again. He tried it again. The same message. The number didn't exist. It was just as his great-aunt had written. He was left with the chilling silence of the old house, the scribbled, non-existent number on the paper, and the lingering echo of a lost woman's voice. The mystery of the house on Sycamore Street had just begun, and he was right in the middle of it. He had to find out who Sarah was, and why she was calling him from a place that wasn't there, using a number that didn't exist. He had a feeling the answers were hidden somewhere within the walls of his new home, and he was determined to uncover them. The phone sat silently on the table, a black, enigmatic sentinel guarding a secret that stretched across time. And Liam knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it would ring again. The silence in the house was heavier now, thick with unspoken questions. Liam sat at his desk, the small piece of paper with the non-existent phone number under the lamp's focused glow. He stared at it until the digits blurred together, a meaningless string of ink on paper. Sarah. The name echoed in the quiet corners of his mind. It was a common name, which made the task ahead feel like searching for a single grain of sand on a vast beach. He knew he couldn't just sit here and wait for the phone to ring again. His great-aunt Clara had heard the calls, written that one cryptic entry, and then apparently done nothing. Or maybe she had tried and failed. Liam wouldn't make that mistake. He was an audio engineer. His job was to find signals in the noise. And this was the loudest noise he'd ever encountered. His first instinct was to use the tools he knew best. He booted up his computer and began to dig. Old phone numbers, especially from the era of that rotary phone, weren't just random digits. They had structures, prefixes assigned to specific geographic areas, sometimes down to a single neighborhood. He spent hours cross-referencing the number Sarah had given him with archived telephone exchange databases. It was a digital rabbit hole, leading him through forums for vintage tech enthusiasts and obscure historical websites. The prefix he discovered was one that Havenwood had decommissioned in the late 1970s. It was a ghost prefix, a digital echo of a system that no longer existed. The number itself yielded nothing. It was a dead end, just as the recorded message had told him. Frustrated, Liam leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The digital world had failed him. He needed to try the analog one. The town of Havenwood itself was the key. His great-aunt's journals, the house, the sycamore tree, the phone, it was all tied here. The next morning, he drove his car into the small town square. It was quaint, with a gazebo in the center and brick-fronted shops lining the streets. His destination was a stately stone building with the words Havenwood Historical Society and Library carved above the entrance. The air inside smelled of aging paper and lemon polish. A woman with a neat bun of silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses looked up from a large, leather-bound book as he approached the main desk. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "I hope so," Liam said, offering a small smile. "My name is Liam Carter. I just moved into the old Miller house on Sycamore Street. Clara was my great-aunt." The woman's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, Clara's boy. I'm Evelyn Reed. It's a pleasure. Clara was a dear friend. I was so sorry to hear of her passing. That house has been waiting for someone to bring some life back into it." "I'm trying my best," Liam replied. "Actually, I'm here because I'm doing a bit of research on the house and the area. I was hoping you might have some old town records or newspapers I could look at." "Of course," Evelyn said, her smile warm. "We have archives going back to the town's founding. Microfiche for the old Havenwood Chronicle, property deeds, family records. What exactly are you looking for? A ghost?" She chuckled lightly, a twinkle in her eye. Liam hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Something like that," he admitted, deciding a sliver of the truth was better than an outright lie. "I'm looking for information on anyone who might have lived in the house before my family, or any significant events that happened on or near Sycamore Street. Specifically, I'm trying to find someone named Sarah." Evelyn's brow furrowed in thought. "Sarah? I don't recall any Sarahs living in that house. It's been in your family for a very long time. But let's see what the records say." She led him to a back room filled with filing cabinets and clunky microfiche readers. For the next 2 hours, Evelyn was his guide through Havenwood's past. They looked through deeds and census records, but as she'd suspected, the house on Sycamore had belonged to his family for nearly a century. There was no Sarah. Perhaps she was a neighbor? A friend? Evelyn suggested. "Maybe," Liam said, feeling a familiar wave of frustration. "What about accidents? Or storms? Was there ever a big one that caused a lot of damage?" "Well, there was the thunderstorm of '78, Evelyn recalled, her eyes looking into the distance. "That was a bad one. Knocked out power for 3 days. The creek flooded its banks. A terrible night." The year caught Liam's attention. The late '70s. Right around the time the phone prefix was decommissioned. "Can we look at the newspapers from around that time?" Evelyn nodded and pulled out a box of microfiche reels labeled Havenwood Chronicle, 1978. Liam carefully threaded one onto the reader, the machine humming to life and projecting the grainy, black and white image of a newspaper page onto the screen. He scrolled through the daily news, the advertisements for cars and appliances that were now vintage classics, the local gossip columns. He scanned the headlines from the days following the storm, looking for anything out of the ordinary. And then he found it. It was a small article, tucked away on page 3 of the paper dated October 27, 1978. The headline was simple: "Local woman missing after storm." Liam leaned closer, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He read the article, his eyes devouring the words. A 20-year-old college student had disappeared during the severe thunderstorm 2 nights prior. She had been driving home from the university in the next town over. Her car, a blue sedan, was found abandoned on the old county road just outside of Havenwood, the engine dead. There was no sign of a struggle, but the driver's side door was ajar. Authorities suspected she had left the vehicle to seek help. A massive search had been conducted, but no trace of her was ever found. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. Liam felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning. He scrolled to the bottom of the article, where a small, grainy photograph of the missing woman was printed. It was a yearbook photo. She had kind eyes and a bright, hopeful smile. He stared at the face of the woman who had called him. Sarah Jenkins. Find something? Evelyn asked, noticing his sudden stillness. Liam couldn't speak for a moment. He just pointed at the screen. Evelyn moved beside him, adjusting her glasses to read the small print. "Oh my," she whispered, her hand going to her chest. "I remember this. Sarah Jenkins. It was so tragic. The whole town prayed for her. Her poor parents, they never gave up hope. Kept her room just as she left it for years. The old county road," Liam said, his voice hoarse. "Where is that?" "It's mostly unused now," Evelyn explained. "The new highway bypassed it about 30 years ago. It runs west of town. Not far from Sycamore Street, actually. If you cut through the woods behind your house, you'd probably run right into it." It all clicked into place with a terrifying, gut-wrenching certainty. Sarah had been driving home in the storm. Her car broke down on a dark road. She saw the lights of a house through the trees, his house. She left her car to find help, but she never made it. She had gotten lost in the storm, in the dark, and in some inexplicable way, she was still lost. Still out there, still trying to make one last, desperate phone call for help. Liam thanked Evelyn, his mind a whirlwind of shock and dawning horror. He made a copy of the article and walked out of the library into the bright afternoon sun, which felt jarringly cheerful. The world looked the same, but for Liam, everything had changed. This wasn't a prank or a crossed wire. It was a ghost story, and he was living in the middle of it. He drove home and walked into the living room, stopping in front of the small table. The black rotary phone sat there, inert and silent. It no longer looked like a charming antique. It looked like a tombstone, a direct line to a 50-year-old tragedy. He now knew the name of the woman on the other end of the line. He knew her story, but knowing wasn't enough. Sarah Jenkins wasn't calling to tell him who she was. She was calling because she was lost and needed help. The question that now screamed in his mind was no longer who was calling, but what in God's name was he supposed to do about it? Knowing Sarah's story had transformed the house. The creaks and groans of the old structure no longer sounded like the house settling. They sounded like footsteps, like whispers just beyond the range of his hearing. Liam found himself listening to the silence, waiting. The black rotary phone was the epicenter of this new, strange reality. He'd cleaned the dust from its casing and traced the elegant curves of the receiver, feeling an odd connection to the object. It was his only link to a lost soul, a piece of technology acting as a bridge across 5 decades of time and tragedy. The fear he'd initially felt was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now mingled with a profound sense of empathy and a heavy weight of responsibility. Sarah wasn't a phantom to be feared. She was a person who had died alone and scared, and for some reason, her final call for help had found him. He didn't have to wait long. 2 days after his visit to the library, in the deep quiet of the late afternoon, the phone rang. The shrill, metallic sound cut through the silence, but this time, Liam was ready. He walked calmly to the table, took a deep breath, and lifted the receiver. "Hello," he said, his voice even. The familiar sound of rushing static filled his ear. Then, her voice, faint and laced with panic. "Is anyone there? Please. I'm so lost." "I'm here," Liam said, speaking clearly and slowly. "I'm here, Sarah." The static on the line seemed to spike for a moment, crackling loudly before subsiding into a softer hiss. There was a long pause. When her voice returned, it was different. The frantic edge was gone, replaced by a tone of utter bewilderment. You know my name?" "Yes, Sarah Jenkins," Liam confirmed softly. "I know who you are. You were driving home from college on a rainy night in 1978. Your car broke down on the old county road." A sound like a choked sob came through the receiver, a sound so filled with anguish that Liam felt a pang in his own chest. "I remember the rain," she whispered, her voice clearer than it had ever been before. "It was so heavy. The engine just stopped. The lights went out. I couldn't see anything. I got out of the car. I thought I saw the lights of a house through the trees." "This house," Liam said. "You saw this house, Sarah." You were trying to get here. I was, she said, her voice trembling. I started walking. I had a necklace. My grandmother gave it to me. A silver locket. I was holding it. I was so scared. I think I dropped it. I tried to find it, but it was too dark. The branches, they were grabbing at me. I fell. The line crackled again, her voice beginning to fade. I'm so cold. Sarah, listen to me, Liam said urgently, sensing he was losing her. Where did you fall? Can you see anything? Any landmarks? A tree, she whispered, the words becoming indistinct again, swallowed by the returning static. A big oak. It was split by lightning. It looks like a hand reaching. Her voice dissolved completely into the hiss, and then, silence. Liam stood holding the dead receiver, his knuckles white. A split oak tree that looked like a hand. It was the first real clue she'd given him, the first piece of information from her side of the veil. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just wait for her next call. He had to go to her. He had to walk the path she had walked. He changed into a pair of sturdy boots, grabbed a powerful flashlight despite the afternoon sun, and stuffed the copy of the newspaper article into his back pocket. He went out the back door and stood at the edge of his property, staring into the dense woods that separated his manicured lawn from the forgotten parts of Havenwood. According to Evelyn, the old county road was back there somewhere. Taking another deep breath, he pushed aside a low-hanging branch and stepped into the trees. The temperature dropped immediately. The thick canopy of leaves overhead dappled the ground in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air was damp and smelled of earth and decaying leaves. It was quiet, the sounds of the town muffled and distant. Liam walked in a straight line, pushing through overgrown ferns and navigating around thickets of thorns. He was an audio engineer, a man who spent his days in a soundproofed room. This was not his element. Every snap of a twig under his boots sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle in the undergrowth made him flinch. He was chasing the ghost of a girl who had died right here, in this very wilderness. After about 15 minutes of walking, the ground began to slope downwards. He saw a break in the trees ahead and pushed towards it. He emerged onto a narrow strip of cracked and faded asphalt, nearly swallowed by weeds and moss. It was the old county road. It was barely recognizable as a road, more like a scar on the landscape, a relic of a time before the highway. It was eerily silent. He couldn't imagine a car driving here, let alone breaking down in a torrential storm. Now for the hard part. He had to find a split oak tree that looked like a hand. He turned on his flashlight, its powerful beam cutting through the gloom under the trees, and began to walk along the edge of the forgotten road, his eyes scanning the dense woods on either side. He walked for what felt like miles, his initial adrenaline giving way to a weary sense of hopelessness. There were hundreds of oak trees, maybe thousands. How could he possibly find the right one? He was about to give up, to turn back before the sun set completely, when he saw it. It was set back about 50 yards from the road, a monstrous, ancient oak tree, far larger than any of the others. A long time ago, a bolt of lightning had cleaved it nearly in two. The surviving half had continued to grow, but the dead half remained, its bare, twisted branches reaching towards the sky like the gnarled fingers of a skeletal hand. It was exactly as Sarah had described it. Liam's heart hammered in his chest. He left the road and pushed his way through the undergrowth toward the tree. The ground around its base was a tangle of exposed roots and moss-covered rocks. He was here. This was the place. This was where Sarah Jenkins had fallen. He knelt, his hand hovering over the damp earth. His flashlight beam swept across the ground, illuminating the intricate network of roots. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he had to look. He scanned the area for several minutes, his light catching on glints of wet leaves and pale fungi. And then, he saw it. Tucked into a crevice where two large roots twisted together, half buried in decades of dirt and decay, was a faint glimmer of silver. His breath hitched. Using his fingers, he carefully scraped away the soil. It was a chain, tarnished and blackened with age. He pulled it gently, and at the end of it, caked in mud but unmistakably there, was a small, heart-shaped locket. He held it in the palm of his hand, the metal cold against his skin. He had found it. Sarah's locket. He wiped the dirt away with his thumb, revealing the delicate floral engravings on its surface. This was real. A solid, physical piece of her life, of her final moments. He was standing in her footsteps, holding the last thing she had held onto. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the woods were now cast in a deep, blue twilight. A cold wind rustled the leaves overhead. He was alone, but he didn't feel alone. He felt a presence, a profound sadness that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath his feet. He had found her locket, but he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He had to get back to the house, back to the phone. He had to tell her he'd found it. The walk back through the woods was a stark contrast to the journey in. Darkness had fallen completely, and the thin beam of Liam's flashlight seemed only to emphasize the vast, impenetrable blackness surrounding him. The familiar sounds of crickets and the rustle of nocturnal animals took on a sinister edge. He clutched the silver locket in his hand, its cold weight a constant, physical reminder of the tragedy that soaked the very ground he walked on. He felt like an intruder, a trespasser in a place of profound sorrow. The woods were no longer just the woods, they were Sarah's final resting place, a sprawling, unmarked grave. When he finally broke through the tree line and saw the warm, welcoming lights of his own back porch, he felt a wave of relief so intense it almost buckled his knees. Inside, he locked the door behind him and leaned against it, his breathing ragged. He slowly uncurled his fingers. The locket lay in his palm, caked with nearly 50 years of earth. He took it to the kitchen sink and, with a soft brush and warm water, gently began to clean it. As the layers of dirt washed away, the intricate engravings of vines and leaves became clear. It was beautifully crafted. A small, delicate clasp on the side was fused shut with corrosion. With a careful bit of work using a small pocket knife, he managed to pry it open. The locket sprang apart, revealing 2 tiny, oval frames inside. The photos were remarkably well preserved, protected from the elements by the locket's tight seal. On the left was a smiling, middle-aged couple, the man with a kind face and dark hair, the woman with the same bright eyes as the girl in the newspaper photo. Her parents. On the right was a picture of Sarah herself, not the formal yearbook photo, but a candid shot. She was laughing, her head tilted back, the picture of youthful joy. Seeing her like this, so full of life, felt like a punch to the gut. This was the person he was talking to. This vibrant, happy young woman was the terrified, disembodied voice on the other end of the line. He closed the locket, the weight of his task settling on him more heavily than ever. He wasn't just solving a mystery, he was bearing witness to the final tragic chapter of a life cut short. He placed the locket on the small table, right beside the base of the black rotary phone. An offering. A connection. He didn't know what to expect. Would the phone ring immediately? Would anything change at all? For the rest of the evening, the house remained silent. Liam sat in his studio, trying to work, but his focus was shot. His eyes kept drifting to the living room, to the phone and the locket sitting side by side like old friends. He eventually gave up and went to bed, but sleep was fitful, filled with dreams of falling rain and a girl's face, frozen in a silent laugh. It was the next afternoon when it happened. He was making coffee, the scent of fresh grounds filling the kitchen, when the familiar ring cut through the air. His heart leaped. He hurried into the living room and snatched up the receiver, his eyes fixed on the locket. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no static. For the first time, the line was completely, unervingly clear. It was as if she were in the next room. Her voice came through, not as a faint, ethereal whisper, but as a solid, present sound, though it was filled with a deep, echoing sadness. "You found it," she said. "It wasn't a question. You found my locket." "Yes," Liam breathed, stunned by the clarity. "I'm holding it right now. Your parents, they're beautiful." A soft sigh traveled across the line. "They were," she said. "I was coming home to them. It was my father's birthday. I was going to surprise him." The clarity of the connection seemed to be unlocking her memory, pulling her back from the confused, looping terror of her death. "I had a letter for him. I wrote it in my dorm room. It was about my grades, about a boy I'd met, silly things. But I know he would have loved it. I promised I would be home in time to give it to him." Liam listened, captivated. This was the unfinished business. This was the anchor holding her here. Not just the violent, lonely death, but the broken promise to a loved one. "Where was the letter, Sarah?" he asked gently. "It was in my glove compartment," she said, her voice sounding more distant again, as if the effort of remembering was pulling her away. "With the car's registration. I was so worried it would get wet." Her voice began to waver, the sorrow overwhelming the newfound clarity. "I never made it home. They waited for me. My mother left the porch light on all night. She always did when I was driving late." Liam's throat felt tight. He could picture it perfectly, a worried mother staring out a window into a storm, waiting for a daughter who would never arrive. "Sarah, I can find the letter," he said, the words coming out before he had even thought them through. "I can deliver it for you." "But the car," she whispered, the confusion returning to her voice. "It was lost. The storm. They found the car, Sarah," he explained patiently. "It was in the newspaper. It was towed away. It might still be somewhere. A junkyard, maybe. I can find it. There was a long silence on the line, a silence so profound Liam thought the connection had been broken. He looked at the locket, its silver surface gleaming in the afternoon light. He was making a promise to a ghost, a promise to find a nearly 50-year-old letter in the wreckage of a car that could be anywhere. It was insane. But as he stood there, in the quiet house that had once belonged to his great-aunt, it felt like the only sane thing to do. Finally, her voice returned, a fragile whisper filled with a flicker of something he hadn't heard before. Hope. You would do that? I will, Liam said, his voice firm with a conviction that surprised him. I promise. The line went dead. There was no static, no click, just a sudden, peaceful silence. He slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. He looked from the phone to the locket. The puzzle had shifted again. His mission was no longer just to understand, it was to act. He had to find Sarah Jenkins's 1976 blue sedan. He had to find a letter that had been sitting in a glove compartment for almost half a century. He had no idea where to start. The police report was sealed, and junkyards from that era were mostly gone, their contents crushed and recycled long ago. But he had made a promise. And in the heavy silence of the old house on Sycamore Street, he knew with absolute certainty that it was a promise he had to keep. In the sober light of day, the promise Liam had made to Sarah felt reckless, almost impossible. Find a 50-year-old letter inside a 50-year-old car. He paced his living room, running through the logistics. The car had been towed, which meant there was a record somewhere. A police report, an impound notice. The modern world ran on data, but he needed data from an era of carbon copies and filing cabinets. His first stop, he decided, had to be the Havenwood Police Department. The station was a small, modern brick building that had clearly been built long after 1978. The officer at the front desk was a young woman who looked like she was barely out of her teens. She listened with a professionally placid expression as Liam explained that he was a historian, of sorts, researching the old Sarah Jenkins disappearance for a project. He asked if it was possible to see the original accident report. Jenkins, 1978, she said, tapping at her keyboard. That's a cold case. And it's sealed. Even if we still had the physical file, and that's a big if, you'd need a court order to access it. She gave him a sympathetic but firm shrug. Sorry, there's nothing I can do. It was the bureaucratic brick wall he had expected, but it was disheartening all the same. His next thought was the DMV, but that seemed even more hopeless. He wasn't law enforcement, he wasn't next of kin. He had no right to the information. He left the police station feeling defeated, the path to keeping his promise already vanishing before him. He was a sound guy, not a detective. He was completely out of his depth. As he drove aimlessly through Havenwood's quiet streets, his mind kept circling back to his one successful lead, Evelyn Reed at the Historical Society. She was a living archive of the town's history. If anyone knew the unofficial, unwritten story of what happened back then, it would be her. He found her in the same back room as before, carefully archiving a box of old photographs. He explained his predicament, editing the ghost part out and framing it as a deep personal interest in solving the last few puzzles of the case. The police records are a dead end, he finished. I'm trying to figure out what happened to her car. I know it's a long shot, but do you have any idea what towing company the county would have used back in the 70s? Evelyn looked up from her photos, her brow furrowed in concentration. She tapped a finger on her chin. Oh goodness. Back then, there was only one company that handled the county contract, especially for anything out on the old roads. It was Hemlock & Sons Towing, run by a fellow named Frank Hemlock. A tough old bird. Is the company still around? Liam asked, a fresh spark of hope igniting. Oh no, she said, shaking her head. Frank passed away years ago, and the business folded not long after. The new highway came through and most of the traffic, and the accidents, moved over there. But... She paused, a glint in her eye. His son, George, is still around. He took over the property when his father died. He never went into the family business. Keeps to himself mostly. People say he's a bit of a hoarder. Never throws anything away. Where does he live? Liam asked, his heart starting to beat faster. Evelyn gave him a set of directions that took him several miles out of town, down a series of winding country roads that grew progressively narrower and more cracked. He eventually found the turnoff she described, a dirt track nearly hidden by overgrown bushes. A faded, hand-painted sign nailed to a tree read, Hemlock, with a stern "No trespassing" painted underneath. Liam hesitated for a moment, then turned down the lane. The property was a shock. It wasn't just a house, it was a sprawling, 10-acre graveyard of forgotten machinery. Rusting tractors, piles of scrap metal, and the skeletal remains of dozens, if not hundreds, of cars were scattered across the landscape, many being slowly consumed by nature. It was a hoarder's paradise and a tetanus nightmare. He parked near a dilapidated barn and got out, the sound of his car door slamming echoing in the unnerving silence. An old man emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a red rag. He was wiry and weathered, with a suspicious squint and a full beard that was more gray than black. This had to be George Hemlock. "This is private property," the man grunted, his voice a low growl. "Sign says no trespassing." "Mr. Hemlock?" "My name is Liam Carter," Liam said, holding up his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Evelyn Reed from the Historical Society sent me. I know this is a strange request, but I'm looking for a car. An old one. One your father might have towed a long time ago." George's squint deepened. "I ain't in the car business. I'm in the leave me alone business. And business is good." He turned to go back into the barn. "Wait," Liam called out. It was from an accident in October of 1978. A young woman named Sarah Jenkins. A blue sedan, found on the old county road. George Hemlock stopped. He didn't turn around, but Liam saw his shoulders tense. He was silent for a long time. "The ghost car," he finally said, his voice quiet. "What?" Liam asked, stepping closer. George turned around slowly, his eyes now filled with something other than suspicion. "It looked like a memory. My dad called it that. He towed it in the morning after the storm. Said it gave him the creeps. An empty car, door hanging open, radio still on, playing nothing but static. He brought it back here. The police came and looked it over, but nobody ever came to claim it. Her family. I guess they couldn't bear to. Is it still here?" Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper. George looked around at the sprawling chaos of his property, a strange look of pride and weariness on his face. "I never throw anything away," he said. "Follow me." He led Liam away from the barn, past rows of decaying vehicles from the 80s and 90s, deeper into the property where the trees grew thicker and the undergrowth was a wild tangle. They were heading to the oldest section, the first generation of his father's collection. And then, he stopped. "There," George said, pointing with his greasy rag. There, under the branches of a large maple tree, sat the rusted-out shell of a car. Most of its blue paint had peeled away, revealing a body of pure, brown rust. All four tires were gone, and the vehicle had sunk several inches into the soft earth. Weeds and vines grew up through the engine bay and had wrapped themselves around the door frames. But the shape was unmistakable. It was a mid-70s sedan. Liam approached it reverently, as if it were a tomb. He ran his hand over the rough, rusted metal of the hood. He was here. He had found it. The passenger side door was missing, but the driver's side was still attached, hanging slightly ajar, just as the newspaper article had described. His eyes were drawn to the dashboard, to the rectangular outline of the glove compartment. It was still closed. After 47 years of sitting in the rain and snow, a forgotten monument to a forgotten tragedy, it was still closed. He had kept his promise. Now, he just had to hope that whatever was inside had survived. Liam stared at the rusted car, a silent, decaying tombstone half swallowed by the earth. George Hemlock stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick with the weight of the past. "Well," George finally grunted. "You gonna stand there looking at it, or are you gonna get in?" The question broke the spell. Liam nodded, approaching the driver's side door. He wrapped his fingers around the handle, a piece of pitted chrome, and pulled. Nothing happened. It was fused shut by a half-century of rust. He pulled again, harder, his boots slipping in the soft dirt. The door didn't budge. George let out a sigh that sounded like gravel rattling in a can. "Hold on," he muttered, and disappeared back toward his barn. He returned a moment later with a long, heavy crowbar. "Never met a problem a little leverage couldn't solve," he said, wedging the tip of the crowbar into the gap between the door and the frame. With a great, groaning heave, he put his weight into it. The sound was horrifying, a high-pitched shriek of tortured metal, like a final scream that had been held in for decades. The rust seal broke with a series of loud cracks, and the door swung open a few inches, hanging crookedly on its hinges. A wave of musty, damp air rolled out, the smell of mildew, decay, and stagnant time. Liam peered inside. The interior was a disaster. The vinyl on the seats was cracked and covered in green and black mold. The dashboard was a landscape of dust and cobwebs. Leaves and dirt covered the floor. He took a deep breath and reached inside, his hand hovering over the glove compartment. The latch, a simple push button, was frozen solid. "Here," George said, handing him the crowbar. "Be gentle." Liam took the heavy tool. It felt clumsy in his hands. He carefully inserted the tip under the edge of the glove compartment door and gave a soft, steady pry. The plastic and metal were brittle. The latch broke with a sharp snap, and the door fell open with a dull thud, spilling some of its contents onto the rotted floor mats. Liam knelt, his heart pounding. He could see a desiccated owner's manual, its pages swollen and stuck together. There was a small tire pressure gauge and what looked like the plastic remains of a ballpoint pen. He carefully reached into the back of the compartment, his fingers brushing against something that wasn't crumbling paper. It was a small pouch, made of a thick, waxy fabric, like an old waterproof map case. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. She had tried to protect it from the rain. His hands trembled as he drew the pouch out into the light. It was stained and stiff, but it had held. He fumbled with a clasp, which flaked away under his touch, and carefully tipped the contents into his palm. Out slid a small stack of folded papers. They were yellowed and fragile, the edges soft with age, but they were whole. He unfolded the first one. At the top, in elegant, youthful cursive, were the words, "Dear Dad." Liam's eyes scanned the first few lines. "I know this will get to you a day late for your birthday, but I wanted to wait to finish it after my midterm grades came in. You won't believe it, but Professor Albright gave me an A on my history paper." It was just as she had said. A simple, loving letter from a daughter to her father. It was filled with the small, beautiful details of her life, her classes, her friends, a funny story about her roommate, and a shy mention of a boy named Michael who played the guitar and worked at the campus radio station. Reading her words, Liam felt an almost unbearable intimacy, a profound sadness for the life that had been extinguished on a dark road just a few miles from here. This letter was the last piece of that life. He carefully folded it and was about to place it back in the pouch when he realized there was something else. Tucked behind Sarah's letter was a second envelope. This one was different. It was a standard, sealed business envelope, slightly discolored but otherwise intact. There was no address on the front. Just two words, written in a hurried, slightly shaky version of Sarah's script, for Michael. Michael, the boy from the letter, the guitarist from the campus radio station. This was something Sarah hadn't mentioned. Why was this letter sealed? Why was it separate? A chill ran down Liam's spine. His simple mission, deliver a birthday letter, had just become infinitely more complicated. The weight of this second, secret letter felt heavier, more mysterious, than the first. He carefully placed both letters into the pouch and stood up, turning to George, who had been watching the entire process in silence. "Thank you," Liam said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't tell you what this means." George Hemlock just nodded, his gaze fixed on the pouch in Liam's hand. "My dad, he wondered about that girl his whole life," he said, his gruff voice softening for the first time. "Said he could feel the sadness in the car. Glad someone's finally doing something about it. Now get on out of here. You're disturbing the rust." Liam drove back to Sycamore Street in a daze. The fragile letters sat on the passenger seat, a tangible link to a voice that only he could hear. He had done it. He had found her final words. But as he pulled into his driveway, his eyes were drawn to the second envelope. For Michael. It was a loose thread, an unexpected turn in a story he thought he was beginning to understand. The house was quiet, the black phone waiting silently on its table. He knew it would ring again. And when it did, he had a new set of questions. Who was Michael, and what was in the letter Sarah never got to give him? The unfinished business, he now realized, ran deeper than a broken promise to her father. The two letters lay on Liam's desk, illuminated by the single cone of light from his lamp. They were flanked by Sarah's silver locket, the three objects forming a small, somber shrine to a life interrupted. One letter represented a promise broken by fate. The other, the sealed one addressed to Michael, represented a mystery. Liam felt a powerful temptation to open it, to know the secret Sarah had carried with her on that final drive. But it felt like a violation, a betrayal of the fragile trust he had built with her. The secret wasn't his to take, it had to be given. He would wait. He sat at his desk long into the night, the silence of the house a stark contrast to the storm of questions in his mind. The call came just before dawn. The sky outside his window was a soft, bruised purple when the rotary phone's ring, now a familiar sound, echoed through the house. He lifted the receiver. "Liam." Her voice was clear, but laced with a new and anxious energy. "Did you?" "I found them, Sarah," he said softly, his eyes on the letters. "I have them. Both of them. They're safe." A sound that was half a sigh, half a sob of relief whispered across the line. It was a sound of profound release, of a burden being lifted after 50 years. "Thank you," she breathed. "My father. I have his letter," Liam assured her. "But Sarah, there was another one. It's sealed. It's for someone named Michael." The silence that followed was sharp and immediate. The perfect clarity of the connection wavered, and for the first time since he'd found the locket, a faint hiss of static crept back onto the line. When she spoke again, her voice was tight with a pain that felt fresh and raw. "You found that. He was a guitarist," Liam prompted gently. "You wrote about him in the letter to your dad." "He was more than that," she whispered, her voice fragile. "He was important. I was going to give him that letter before I left campus. But I couldn't find him. I was in a hurry to get home for Dad's birthday, so I took it with me. I thought I would mail it from Havenwood." The static grew a little louder, crackling like dying embers. "What's in the letter, Sarah?" Liam asked. "What did you need to tell him?" "A truth," she said, her voice strained. "And a goodbye. It's hard to remember everything clearly. It's all jumbled. The rain, the fear. But I know that letter was important. It was a promise I was breaking. Please, Liam, you have to find him. He needs to have it. He needs to know." "Know what?" Liam pressed, but it was too late. The emotional turmoil was too much for the fragile connection. "Please find Michael." Her voice dissolved into a rush of static, like a radio station losing its signal, and then she was gone. Liam was left holding the silent receiver. A truth and a goodbye. A broken promise. The mystery of Sarah Jenkins was no longer just about her death. It was about her life, and the secret she was trying to resolve in her final hours. He now had his next impossible task: find Michael. A college student with no last name, from 50 years ago. He started where any modern search would: the internet. He spent hours searching for archives from Northgate University's student radio station, WNGU, from the 1970s. He found a few digitized pamphlets and a grainy photo of a fundraising event, but no staff lists, no names. He searched for online versions of the 1978 Northgate yearbook, but the university's digital archives were sparse for that era. The digital world, once again, was offering him nothing. The next morning, he got in his car and drove the 40 miles to Northgate. The campus was a strange mix of architecture. Gothic stone buildings covered in ivy stood next to sleek, modern structures of glass and steel. He felt like a time traveler, walking through a place that was both exactly as Sarah would have known it and completely alien. He found his way to the main library, a vast, quiet space that smelled of books and scholarly pursuit. In the Special Collections department, a helpful graduate student led him to a shelf of university yearbooks. He pulled out the heavy volume for 1978. The cover was a deep blue with the university crest embossed in gold. He carried it to a table and sat down, his heart thumping. He was about to look into Sarah's world. He found her official student photo easily. Sarah Jenkins. The same bright, hopeful smile from the newspaper clipping. Seeing her here, among her classmates, made her feel so real it hurt. He then turned to the section on student clubs and activities. His fingers traced down the list until he found it: WNGU Radio. He turned the page. There was a full-page spread for the campus station. A group of about 15 students were pictured, gathered around a large mixing board, laughing and mugging for the camera. They were a perfect snapshot of the era: shaggy hair, bell-bottoms, band t-shirts. And there, in the front row, sitting on a stool and holding an acoustic guitar, was a young man with dark, wavy hair and a confident smile. Liam's eyes scanned the caption printed below the photo, his finger moving from name to name. And then, he stopped. Michael Serrano. He stared at the face of the young man in the picture. This was him. This was Michael, the recipient of the secret letter. Liam felt a surge of triumph. He had a name, a full name. He quickly took a photo of the picture and the caption with his phone. The initial elation, however, was quickly tempered by the reality of his situation. He had found a ghost from 1978. But the man, Michael Serrano, would now be nearly 70 years old. Where was he now? Did he still live in the area? Did he even know what happened to the girl who wrote him one last, secret letter? Liam closed the heavy yearbook. The face of young Michael Serrano burned into his mind. He had found the name, but the real search, the search for a man across a 50-year chasm of time, had just begun. The drive back from Northgate University was filled with a nervous, focused energy. Liam had a name and a face. Michael Serrano. He kept glancing at the photo on his phone, the black and white image of a smiling, confident young man with a guitar. This was the person who held the key to the second half of Sarah's story. Finding him felt like a tangible victory, a solid foothold in a mystery that had, until now, been composed of whispers and shadows. But as he merged back onto the highway, the sheer scale of the task ahead began to sink in. Michael Serrano was a common enough name. The smiling 20-year-old in the photo was now a man approaching 70. He could be anywhere. Back in his studio, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his own technology, Liam felt more in his element. He was no detective, but he was a master of the digital domain. He cracked his knuckles and began to search. He started broadly, typing Michael Serrano into social media search bars. The results were overwhelming. Hundreds of profiles flooded his screen. There were Michaels from Texas, California, Florida. Young, old, and everything in between. He tried to narrow the search, adding Northgate University or guitarist, but the results were a frustrating jumble of garage bands and alumni pages with no useful information. It was like looking for a single voice in a stadium full of people shouting. He realized he needed a more professional tool. He subscribed to a paid public record service, the kind that aggregates data from dozens of sources. Here, he could be more specific. He entered the name, Michael Serrano. He put in an estimated birth year of 1958. And he added a key piece of information, a former resident of the state where Northgate University was located. The database churned for a moment, and the list of hundreds was suddenly reduced to just four. 4 men in the United States named Michael Serrano, of approximately the right age, who had once lived in the right state. It was a manageable number. Liam took the 4 names and went back to social media, this time with a purpose. The first 2 were dead ends. One was a retired accountant in Arizona with a profile full of pictures of his grandchildren and golf swings. The second was a doctor in Oregon. Neither of them felt right. The third had a locked, private profile with no public photos. A possible, but a frustrating one. Then he typed in the 4th name, Michael Serrano, with a current address in Austin, Texas. A LinkedIn profile appeared first. Michael Serrano. Title, Retired Senior Audio Producer, AMLG Records. Liam's heart skipped a beat. Audio producer. Radio station. The connection was immediate and electric. He clicked on the profile. The picture showed a man in his late 60s with warm, kind eyes, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and laugh lines around his mouth. He was older, his hair was shorter, but the underlying structure of his face, the shape of his smile, it was him. It was the boy from the yearbook. Liam quickly switched to Facebook and found the corresponding profile. It was public. The profile picture was the same, but the other photos were a treasure trove. There were pictures of him with his family, pictures from a recent trip to Italy, and, in the background of a photo taken in his home office, Liam saw it. Hanging on the wall was a vintage electric guitar, and next to it, on a bookshelf, was an old, silver radio microphone, the kind used in broadcast studios in the 70s. This was him. There was no doubt left in Liam's mind. He had found Michael Serrano. He stared at the screen, at the face of this man living a quiet, retired life in Texas, completely unaware that a ghost from his distant past was trying to reach him. The elation of the discovery quickly gave way to a profound sense of dread. What now? He had the man's address, his entire life story laid out in a digital portfolio. He could send him a message, an email, even call him. But what would he say? Hello, a girl you knew 50 years ago, who died tragically, has been calling me on a disconnected phone and asked me to give you a letter. He'd be dismissed as a crank, a scammer, or worse. The police might be called. The story was too fragile, too sacred, to be broken over a fiber optic cable. This was a message that had been waiting half a century to be delivered. It had to be done in person. The decision solidified in his mind with a terrifying clarity. He couldn't mail the letters. He couldn't make a phone call. He had to go to Austin. He had to stand on Michael Serrano's doorstep and look him in the eye. He would need a cover story, something believable that would get him through the door. He wasn't Liam Carter, the accidental medium. He was Liam Carter, a historical researcher, or maybe a writer for a true crime podcast. He was working on a piece about the unsolved disappearance of Sarah Jenkins, reaching out to people who knew her to help paint a picture of her life. It was plausible. It was respectful. And it was his only shot. Within the hour, he had booked a flight to Austin for the following morning. He went into his office and took out the waxed pouch. He looked at the 2 letters, one for a father who was almost certainly long gone, and one for a man he was about to meet. He carefully placed the pouch, along with Sarah's locket, into his travel bag. As he packed, the house was silent. The black phone sat on its table, as if it knew its part in the story was, for the moment, complete. It had made the connection. Now it was up to Liam to see it through. He zipped his bag shut, a feeling of nervous, high-stakes finality washing over him. He was no longer just an investigator. He was a courier, carrying a message across the boundaries of time and death. And his delivery address was in Austin, Texas. The flight to Austin was a surreal bubble of disconnect. Liam sat in a window seat, watching the patchwork of the American landscape slide by thousands of feet below, the precious 50-year-old letters safely stowed in his carry-on bag. He was an audio engineer, a man who dealt in sound waves and frequencies, yet here he was, flying across the country on a mission from a ghost. He went over his cover story a dozen times in his head, the words feeling flimsy and inadequate against the profound, supernatural truth of his purpose. He was terrified of failing, of saying the wrong thing and being dismissed as a lunatic. More than that, he was terrified of the look on an old man's face when he dredged up a tragedy that had been buried for half a century. The Texas heat hit him like a physical wall the moment he stepped out of the airport. It was a different world from the crisp, cool air of Havenwood. He rented a car, the air conditioning blasting, and followed the GPS navigation through the bustling city to a quiet, tree-lined suburb. He found the street easily. The houses were comfortable, well-maintained single-story homes with green lawns and neatly trimmed hedges. It was a portrait of peaceful, suburban retirement. He parked a little way down the street from Michael Serrano's address and just sat in the car for a few minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The house was a pleasant beige color with a dark blue door. A large, shady oak tree stood in the front yard. It was aggressively, terrifyingly normal. This was the final destination. The end of a trail that had started with a phantom phone call in a dusty old house. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Liam got out of the car, smoothed down his shirt, and walked up the stone path to the front door. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He felt as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff. He raised his hand and rang the doorbell. He heard footsteps, and then the door opened. The man standing there was instantly recognizable. He was older, his face lined with a map of a life well lived, his hair a neat, close-cropped silver. But the eyes were the same. The kind, intelligent eyes from the LinkedIn photo, and the same underlying smile from the 1978 yearbook. It was Michael Serrano. "Can I help you?" Michael asked, his voice calm and friendly. Liam's rehearsed words felt like sandpaper in his mouth. "Mr. Serrano? My name is Liam Carter. I apologize for showing up unannounced like this. I know it's incredibly forward of me." "Okay," Michael said, his friendly expression shifting to one of polite curiosity. "I'm a writer," Liam began, the cover story feeling more real as he spoke it. "I'm working on a long-form story about an old cold case from the Havenwood area. The disappearance of a Northgate University student back in 1978. I was hoping to speak to people who knew her, to help paint a picture of who she was. Her name was Sarah Jenkins." The change in Michael Serrano's expression was instantaneous and profound. It wasn't dramatic, but a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a flicker of shock in his eyes that was quickly masked by a profound, deep-seated sadness. The friendly retiree vanished, replaced by a man looking at a ghost. The name, Liam realized, had been a key, unlocking a door that had been sealed for decades. "Sarah," Michael said, the name a soft, exhaled whisper. He seemed to shrink a little, the years falling away and then crashing back down on him all at once. "My God, I haven't heard that name in a very long time." He stared at Liam, really seeing him for the first time, his mind clearly racing. "How did you find me?" "I was looking through old Northgate yearbooks," Liam explained, keeping his voice gentle. "I saw you in a photo for the campus radio station. WNGU. Sarah's family journals mentioned she was friends with someone from the station." It was a lie, but a plausible one. Michael nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Yeah, we were good friends." He looked from Liam's face to the quiet, sunny street behind him, as if he expected to see something else there. He seemed to make a decision. "You better come in," he said, stepping back and holding the door open. Liam walked into a cool, air-conditioned home. It was tastefully decorated, with bookshelves lining one wall and a beautiful grand piano in the corner of the living room. Michael led him to a pair of comfortable armchairs. "I'm sorry to bring all this up," Liam said as he sat down. "I can only imagine how jarring this must be." "It is," Michael admitted, sinking into the chair opposite him. "But it's all right. Sarah, she deserves to be remembered." He looked at Liam, his eyes searching. "What do you want to know?" For the next hour, Liam listened. He asked gentle, open-ended questions, and Michael, after his initial shock, began to talk. He spoke of Sarah with a mixture of fondness and a raw, lingering grief that was shocking in its intensity, even after all this time. He described her passion for music, her infectious laugh, how she would come into the radio station and argue with him for hours about classic rock versus new wave. He painted a picture of a vibrant, intelligent, fiercely alive young woman. She was one of the brightest people I ever knew, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. She was going to do something amazing with her life. We all knew it. He described the last time he saw her, the day she disappeared. She was stressed about her midterms, but excited to go home for her dad's birthday. She was looking for me before she left, I think, but I was in a recording session off campus. My roommate told me later she'd stopped by. He recounted the confusion of the following days, the initial worry turning to dread, the news of her empty car being found, and then nothing. The endless, agonizing silence of an unsolved mystery. It was like she just vanished from the face of the earth, he said, his voice low. For years, I'd have dreams that she'd just show up one day, with some wild story about where she'd been. But she never did. Liam sat in silence, the weight of the 2 letters in his bag feeling like a physical pressure against his chest. He had done it. He had made the connection. He had heard the story from the other side. This quiet, decent man had carried a torch of grief and unanswered questions for 50 years. And in Liam's bag, he had the answer to some of them, and the beginning of 1,000 more. He knew he couldn't push it any further today. He had opened the wound, now he had to give it time to breathe. The moment to reveal the letters would have to be perfect. As Michael trailed off, lost in a memory of a laughing girl in a 1970s radio station, Liam knew the hardest part of his journey was still ahead. A heavy silence settled in the room, thick with the ghosts of 50-year-old memories. Michael Serrano stared at a fixed point across the room, his mind clearly back in the halls of Northgate University. Liam knew he couldn't leave this man adrift in his grief. He had to anchor him to the present, to the reason he was really here. He cleared his throat softly. "Michael," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael's eyes refocused on him, filled with a distant sorrow. "The reason I came to you, the reason I had to find you, it's more than just a writer's curiosity. My research into Sarah's case has been unconventional." Michael's brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "This was it. The point of no return. I managed to locate Sarah's car," Liam said, the words landing with the force of a physical blow. Michael sat bolt upright, his face a mask of disbelief. "What? That's impossible. They searched for years. How could you possibly?" "It was never destroyed," Liam explained, keeping his voice steady and calm. "It was towed to a local family-owned impound lot after the police finished with it. The lot went out of business, but the son never threw anything away. It's been sitting in a field, rusting away, for almost 50 years. He decided to leave George Hemlock's name out of it, to keep the story as simple as possible." "My God," Michael breathed, shaking his head in astonishment. "After all this time, I was able to get inside the car," Liam continued, reaching slowly for his bag. "And in the glove compartment, I found something. Something Sarah had protected in a waterproof pouch." He pulled out the waxed fabric pouch and placed it gently on the coffee table between them. Michael stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. With trembling hands, Liam opened the pouch and carefully slid out the first folded letter. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but the handwriting was clear. "I believe this is the letter she wrote to her father for his birthday," he said, pushing it slowly across the table. Michael didn't touch it at first. He just stared at the familiar, looping cursive. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the first few lines. A choked sound escaped his throat, and he finally reached out, his fingers shaking, and picked up the fragile pages. He held a tangible piece of her, a final, cheerful message from a life that was about to be extinguished. Tears welled in his eyes, and he bowed his head, his shoulders shaking silently. Liam said nothing, giving him the space and the silence his grief deserved. This was a sacred moment, a reunion across an impossible divide. After a few long, heavy minutes, Michael looked up, his eyes red. He carefully folded the letter and placed it on the table. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "To be able to read this, it's a gift I never imagined possible." Liam took a deep breath. Now for the final, most difficult step. "There was something else in the pouch with it, Michael," he said, his voice low and serious. "Another envelope. It was sealed." He reached back into the pouch and pulled out the second letter, the one with the 2 simple words on the front. He placed it on the table next to the first one. "It was addressed to you." Michael's gaze dropped to the second envelope. He saw his own name, written in her hand. The shock on his face was even more profound than before. It was a look of utter, gut-wrenching bewilderment. He reached for it, his hand hesitating just above the paper before finally picking it up. He turned it over and over, staring at his name. A message he was never supposed to receive. "I don't understand," he said, looking at Liam, his eyes filled with a storm of questions. "How did you know to look for the car? How did you even know to start any of this? The police gave up on this decades ago." Liam knew the cover story of being a writer was no longer enough. He couldn't tell the whole truth, but he had to give him something more. "My interest in this case is deeply personal," he said, choosing his words with extreme care. "I recently inherited a house in Havenwood, the old Miller house on Sycamore Street." Michael's eyes widened in recognition. The house she was trying to get to. "Yes," Liam confirmed. "Living there, you feel the history. You feel the stories in the walls. Her story, in particular, is very strong there. I felt a pull, a responsibility to find answers. It's like the house, her memory, it pointed me in the right direction. First to the historical society, then to the old newspaper articles, and finally to the car. To these letters." He let the ambiguous explanation hang in the air, allowing Michael to interpret a pull, and her memory pointing the way however he could. It was the truth, just not the literal truth. Michael looked from Liam's earnest face down to the sealed envelope in his hands. He seemed to be processing Liam's strange, mystical explanation, and perhaps, after 50 years of inexplicable loss, he was more open to it than a stranger might have been. He held the past in his hands, a truth and a goodbye he never knew existed. The question of what was inside, of what Sarah's final secret words to him were, filled the room with an almost unbearable tension. He ran his thumb over the sealed flap, the silence stretching on, a 50-year-old seal waiting to be broken. The world seemed to shrink to the space between Michael Serrano's hands, to the fragile 50-year-old envelope that held a secret he never knew existed. Liam held his breath, a silent observer in a moment that felt impossibly private. He had only been the messenger, but now he was a witness to the final, painful act of the delivery. Michael's thumb slid under the flap of the envelope. With a faint, dry rasp of tearing paper, the seal that had been set in 1978 was finally broken. Michael carefully unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Liam could see the same elegant, looping cursive as the other letter. Michael's eyes scanned the first few lines, his expression tight with concentration. Then, as he continued to read, a wave of visible emotions washed over his face. First came a deep, furrowed confusion, as if the words made no sense. This was followed by a sudden, sharp widening of his eyes, a look of pure, unadulterated shock. His hand, the one not holding the letter, came up to cover his mouth. A soft, strangled gasp escaped him. He read the letter again, and then a third time, as if trying to force his mind to accept what his eyes were seeing. Finally, he lowered the letter, his hand trembling so violently the paper rattled. He stared blankly at the far wall, his face pale, his eyes hollow with a grief so profound it seemed to steal the very air from the room. He was no longer a man remembering a college friend. He was a man staring into the abyss of a life he had never known. He sat that way for what felt like an eternity. Liam didn't dare speak, didn't dare move. At last, Michael took a ragged, shuddering breath and looked at Liam, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. We had a fight," he said, his voice a broken, hoarse whisper. "A stupid fight. About our future. I wanted to move to California after graduation, to get into the music business. She wanted to stay closer to home. She loved Havenwood. I told her she was thinking small. I was an idiot. A young, arrogant idiot." He shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the lines on his face. "After that, she grew distant. 4 weeks. I thought I had driven her away. That she was breaking up with me. I was too proud, too stubborn to ask what was wrong. And then, she was gone." He looked down at the letter in his hand, as if its weight were too much to bear. "This letter," he choked out. This was her explaining. He took another shaky breath and began to read it aloud, his voice cracking with the weight of every word. "My dearest Michael," he read. "If you are reading this, it means I couldn't find the courage to tell you in person. I am so sorry. For everything. For the distance between us. You were right to want to follow your dreams. And I want you to. You have to go to California and be the brilliant producer I know you will be. But I can't go with you. I have to stay here. Not because I'm thinking small, but because my world is about to get a lot bigger. Michael, I'm pregnant." Liam felt the words like a physical impact, a sudden, brutal clarification of the entire tragedy. Michael's voice broke, and he had to stop, pinching the bridge of his nose. He composed himself and continued reading. I'm keeping the baby. I'm going to raise him or her in Havenwood with my family's help. I didn't want to trap you. I didn't want you to give up on your life because of me, because of this. This is my choice. This letter is not a plea. It's a truth. And it's a goodbye. I will love you, always. But I have to let you go. Please, be happy. Love, Sarah. He finished reading and the letter slipped from his fingers, drifting down to the coffee table. The secret was out, laid bare in the quiet, sunlit living room. It was devastating in its simplicity. She hadn't been breaking up with him out of anger. She had been setting him free out of love. A baby, Michael whispered, staring into space. She was pregnant. And I was angry with her. The last thing I ever felt for her was anger over some stupid, selfish argument. The full weight of the 50-year-old loss, now compounded with the loss of a child he never knew, crashed down on him. He buried his face in his hands, and the silent shaking turned into deep, heart-wrenching sobs. Liam felt utterly helpless. He was a stranger who had walked into this man's life and detonated a bomb of grief and regret at its very foundation. He had delivered the message. He had fulfilled his promise to the voice on the phone. But seeing the wreckage it had caused was agonizing. After a long time, Michael's sobs subsided. He scrubbed his face with his hands and looked at Liam, his expression raw and exposed. But there was something else in his eyes now, too. A flicker of dawning, painful understanding. All of Liam's talk about the house, about feeling a pull, suddenly clicked into place for him. She's still there, isn't she? Michael asked, his voice quiet, devoid of skepticism. In that house, on that road. She's lost. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact from a man who had just been handed a miracle wrapped in a tragedy. She sent you. Sarah sent you to me. Liam could only nod, the line between the natural and the supernatural having dissolved completely. Yes, he said. I think she did. Her work wasn't finished. She had to tell you the truth. Michael looked down at the letter, at the last physical words of the woman he had loved, the mother of his unknown child. The mystery was solved. The secret was told. But the profound sadness remained. The message had been delivered, but the messenger, Sarah, was still trapped in the storm, calling out from a place that didn't exist, waiting to be found. And now, for the first time, there were two of them who could hear her. The aftermath of the letter's revelation was a profound and heavy stillness. The sun shifted in the Texas sky, casting long afternoon shadows across Michael Serrano's living room, but inside, time seemed to have stopped. Liam sat, a silent custodian of a 50-year-old secret, while Michael seemed to wrestle with the ghosts of his past, his present, and a future that had been stolen from him before he ever knew it existed. The grief was still there, a palpable presence in the room, but beneath it, Liam could sense something else beginning to stir in the older man, the quiet, determined grit of a man who had been given an impossible final task. Michael finally raised his head, his eyes no longer just filled with sorrow, but with a new, sharp clarity. He looked at Liam, not as a stranger or a writer, but as an undeniable link to the woman he had lost. For 50 years, Michael said, his voice raspy but steady, I grieved the girl who disappeared. Now I know I was grieving the woman she was becoming, and the child we would have had. It changes everything. He picked up the two letters from the coffee table, his touch gentle and reverent. You delivered the message, Liam. You did what she asked. But it can't be over. If it were, why would she still be calling? It was the question Liam had been asking himself. I don't know, he admitted. I thought maybe the letters were the only thing tying her here. Her unfinished business. It was part of it, Michael said, a new conviction in his tone. It was the most important part. She wanted me to know the truth. She didn't want my last memory of her to be one of anger and confusion. He paused, looking down at her elegant handwriting. But Sarah, she was practical. She was a planner. The idea of her being lost, adrift. That's what's wrong. It's not just the message that's lost. It's her. The unspoken thought that had been lingering in the back of Liam's mind finally came to the forefront. Her body, Liam said softly. They never found her. Michael nodded, his jaw tight. Exactly. She's not just a lost voice, Liam. She is a lost person. A spirit can't rest if it doesn't have a place to rest. They searched for weeks, but that storm was biblical. The creeks flooded, there were mudslides, whole parts of those woods were inaccessible. They did their best, but they missed her. He looked up, his gaze intense. She wasn't just trying to get to your house for help. She was trying to get home. A new, shared understanding flowed between them. The mission wasn't over. In fact, the most critical part had just begun. Delivering the letters was the key that had unlocked the final door, revealing the true objective: bring Sarah home. What do we do? Liam asked, the "we" feeling natural and right. We go back, Michael said without a moment's hesitation. I have to go back. You have to take me to where you found the locket. To that split oak tree. That was her last landmark. That's where we need to start looking. The thought of Michael Serrano, a man in his late 60s, returning to the site of his life's greatest trauma to search for the remains of his long-lost love was staggering. But looking at the resolve on his face, Liam knew there was no other way. This was Michael's story as much as it was Sarah's. He had to be there for the final chapter. Her parents, Michael said suddenly, his thoughts racing ahead. The letter to her father. Are they? I don't know, Liam admitted. They would be very old if they were still alive. I can try to find out. We'll bring it with us, Michael decided. Even if they're gone, there has to be a family plot. A place for her. The letter belongs with her. The next hour was a blur of quiet, focused activity. Liam went online and changed his return flight, booking a second seat for Michael. Michael made a single phone call to his daughter, his voice calm as he explained he had to take a sudden trip to deal with something from a long time ago. He packed a small overnight bag with a stoic efficiency that belied the emotional earthquake he had just endured. His grief had found a purpose, channeling itself into a clear and undeniable mission. As they drove to the airport, the 2 letters and Sarah's locket resting in a pouch in Michael's bag, an odd sense of peace settled between them. The surreal nature of their quest was overshadowed by the profound rightness of it. They were 2 strangers, a generation apart, united by the voice of a woman trapped between worlds. On the plane, as the lights of Texas dwindled below, Michael turned to Liam. When she calls you, he said, his voice low so only Liam could hear, what does it sound like? The static. Is it like a radio that's not quite on the station? Liam nodded. Exactly like that. And her voice is faint, like it's coming from a long way away. Michael, the retired audio producer, closed his eyes. A weak signal, struggling to get through the noise, he murmured, more to himself than to Liam. She just needs us to find her. To amplify the signal. Liam looked out the window into the dark, star-filled sky. He had flown to Austin alone, a reluctant messenger on an unbelievable journey. He was flying back as part of a team, an ally in a sacred rescue mission. They were heading back to Havenwood, back to the old house in the dark woods, flying directly into the heart of a 50-year-old storm. But this time, they were armed with the truth. And for the first time, Liam felt a flicker not just of purpose, but of hope. Hope that they could finally silence the static and bring the lost voice on the line to peace. The return journey to Havenwood was a mirror image of Liam's departure, yet fundamentally different. Where before there was solitary, nervous anticipation, now there was a shared, somber purpose. They landed late at night. The air that greeted them was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine, a stark contrast to the oppressive Texas heat. It was the smell of home for Liam, but for Michael, Liam could only imagine it was the smell of a memory, a place he had spent 50 years trying to forget and was now returning to with a singular, painful mission. The drive from the small regional airport to Sycamore Street was mostly silent. The further they got from the highway and the deeper they drove into the winding country roads, the more the tension in the car seemed to grow. Liam watched Michael out of the corner of his eye. The older man stared out the window, his face illuminated by the passing dashboard lights, his expression a mixture of grief and a kind of steely resolve. He was looking at the landscape of his youth, now haunted by the ghosts of his greatest loss. When they finally pulled into the driveway of the house on Sycamore Street, Michael let out a slow, quiet breath. So that's it, he whispered, his eyes fixed on the old Victorian house, its pale yellow paint glowing softly under the porch light Liam had left on. The house on the hill. He got out of the car and stood on the lawn for a long moment, just looking up at it. He was finally seeing the beacon Sarah had been fighting her way toward through the storm. Liam unlocked the front door and pushed it open, stepping aside. Welcome to my home, he said quietly. Michael stepped over the threshold, his movements slow and deliberate. He ran a hand along the carved wooden banister, his eyes taking in every detail of the entryway. He was a man stepping into a dream, a place he had imagined 1,000 times but had never seen. His gaze swept the living room and then landed, with an almost physical jolt, on the small table by the wall. On it sat the black rotary phone. He approached it with a sense of reverence, as if it were a holy relic. He didn't touch it, but simply stood before it, his hands clasped behind his back. So this is it, he murmured. The line. As an audio professional, he understood the utter impossibility of what this object had done. A disconnected piece of plastic and metal had somehow reached across time and death to deliver a message. It was a miracle, and he was staring at its source. "Thank you," he whispered to the inanimate object, a profound gratitude in his voice that sent a shiver down Liam's spine. That night, Michael slept in the guest room, and the house was quiet. The phone did not ring. It was as if it knew its work was done, that the connection it had forged was now a human one. The next morning, they began to plan. Over coffee at the kitchen table, the mood was not one of grief, but of methodical determination. "First things first," Michael said, pulling out a small notebook. "Her family. Her parents were Robert and Eleanor Jenkins. If they're gone, we need to find out where they're buried. That's likely where her plot would be, if they bought one for her." "I can go to the Historical Society," Liam offered. "Evelyn Reed will know. She remembers the case." "Good," Michael said, making a note. "Second, we need to be smart about the search. We can't just wander around. That area is dense woods. We need a topographical map of the area from that time, if possible. We need to identify low-lying areas, places where flooding and mudslides might have carried her, away from the main search grid." He was thinking like a producer, a project manager, breaking an impossible task down into manageable steps. "We'll also need tools. Shovels, soil probes, maybe a good metal detector. The locket you found was silver. Her belt buckle, keys, anything else she might have had on her would be metal." They spent the rest of the morning making lists and planning logistics. Liam drove into town and visited Evelyn, who, with her characteristic quiet efficiency, was able to find the information on the Jenkins family in the town's records. Robert and Eleanor had passed away in the late 1990s and were buried together in Havenwood's main cemetery. There was, as Michael had predicted, a third empty plot beside them, marked by a simple heartbreaking stone that read only, "Sarah Jenkins, born 1958, lost 1978, beloved daughter." When Liam returned and told Michael, the older man just nodded grimly. "All right," he said. "So she has a place waiting for her. We just have to bring her home." That afternoon, armed with rented equipment and a new, detailed map of the woods, they made their first trip to the site together. As they stepped from Liam's yard into the dense canopy of the trees, a somber quiet fell between them. Liam led the way, back along the path he now knew so well. When they finally reached the clearing with the split oak tree, its skeletal branches reaching for the sky, Michael stopped. He walked slowly to the base of the massive tree, the place where Liam had found the locket. He reached out and placed his palm flat against the rough, ancient bark. He closed his eyes. Liam stood back, giving him his space, watching as Michael stood on the very ground where Sarah's life had likely ended. He was connecting with her, with the past, across a 50-year divide, at the foot of the last landmark she had ever seen. The sun filtered down through the leaves, dappling the ground in a soft, gentle light. The woods were silent, expectant. The search was about to begin. Michael opened his eyes, a look of profound sadness but unshakable resolve on his face. He turned to Liam. "Okay," he said. "Let's get to work." The work began with a solemn, methodical purpose. Michael spread the old topographical map across the hood of Liam's car, his finger tracing the faint blue lines that indicated streams and the tightly packed brown lines that showed a steep ravine running down from the ridge where the old oak stood. The storm came from the northwest, he reasoned, his voice that of a strategist planning a campaign. The rain would have washed everything downhill, southeast. She fell by the tree, but if she was caught in a flash flood or a mudslide, this ravine is the most likely place she would have ended up. They established a grid, marking it out with brightly colored tape tied to branches, starting from the base of the tree and moving methodically downslope towards the ravine. The labor was grueling. The forest floor was a thick mat of roots, rocks, and 50 years of accumulated decay. Liam, young and fit, handled most of the digging, while Michael, his movements slow but deliberate, meticulously swept the ground ahead of them with a metal detector. The first day was a lesson in frustration. The detector chirped and beeped constantly, its sounds echoing in the quiet woods. Each signal sent a jolt of adrenaline through them, a spike of hope that was almost immediately crushed. They unearthed a collection of mundane artifacts left by decades of hunters, hikers, and time itself. A dozen rusted shotgun shells, a corroded belt buckle from the 1980s, the pull tab from an ancient can of soda, and a silver dollar from 1964. Each discovery felt like a small, cruel joke, a reminder of how much the world had moved on while Sarah had remained lost in this very spot. By the end of the second day, exhaustion had set in. They returned to the house on Sycamore Street, caked in dirt and sweat, their muscles aching. They ate their dinner in a near-silent camaraderie, the shared physical toll forging a bond between them that words couldn't. During those quiet evenings, Michael would talk, sharing memories of Sarah that seemed to be unearthed by the digging. She hated the woods, you know, he said one evening, staring out the kitchen window into the dark. Thought they were creepy. She was a town girl. She loved streetlights and the sound of cars. The irony that she ended up here. He trailed off, shaking his head. Another time, he spoke of her dreams. She wanted to be a journalist, a foreign correspondent. She wanted to travel the world and tell the stories that no one else was telling. She was fearless like that. Liam listened, realizing he was becoming the custodian of Michael's memories, just as he had been the recipient of Sarah's calls. He was the bridge between the two, and the quiet old house was the anchor holding it all together. The phone on its table remained silent, its job done. It had made the introduction, the rest was up to them. On the third day, the strain began to show. They had cleared their initial grid around the tree and were now working their way into the steeper, more treacherous terrain of the ravine. The work was slower, more dangerous. A feeling of despair, cold and heavy, began to creep in. They had found nothing. Not a button, not a scrap of fabric, nothing. Maybe this is a mistake, Michael said, his voice heavy with defeat as they sat on a mossy rock, sharing a bottle of water. We're digging for a ghost, Liam. Maybe she's just gone. Washed away to nothing. Maybe there's nothing left to find. Liam didn't know what to say. The rational part of his brain agreed. The odds were astronomically against them. But the memory of that clear, desperate voice on the phone, the sheer, undeniable reality of it, refused to let him give up. Let's just finish this section for today, he said, trying to keep his own hope from flagging. Down to that cluster of birch trees. Then we'll call it a day. Michael agreed with a weary nod. They got back to work, the movements automatic now, the hope almost gone, replaced by a grim sense of duty. Liam cleared away a patch of thick ferns at the bottom of the ravine, and Michael swept the newly exposed earth with a detector. It let out a weak, but clear and high-pitched tone. Probably another coin, Michael muttered, not even looking up. But something felt different. The tone was purer than the scratchy signals from the rusted iron they'd been finding. Liam knelt down with a hand trowel and carefully scraped at the damp, black soil. About 4 inches down, the trowel hit something small and hard. He dug around it with his fingers, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He pulled it from the earth. It wasn't a coin. It was a single key, blackened and tarnished with age, with a distinct, rounded top. He wiped the dirt away with his thumb. Faintly, but unmistakably, he could see the faded blue oval logo of the Ford Motor Company. It was a car key. A Ford key from the 1970s. Michael, Liam said, his voice tight. Michael looked over, his eyes weary. Then he saw what Liam was holding. He dropped the metal detector and stumbled over, kneeling beside him. He took the key from Liam's outstretched hand, his own trembling. He stared at it, turning it over and over. A Ford Granada, he whispered, his voice cracking. She drove a 1976 Ford Granada. Blue. This was her car key. They stared at the key, a tiny miraculous piece of metal resting in Michael's palm. It wasn't the end of their search, but it was everything. It was proof. It was a signpost from the past, an arrow pointing them forward. She was here. She was close. Their exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and a burning, absolute certainty. They were no longer just digging in the woods. They were digging in the right place. They looked at each other, and then their eyes were drawn further down the ravine, following the path the water would have taken. They knew where they had to look tomorrow. They were going to find her. The discovery of the key changed the atmosphere between them. The exhaustion and frustration of the past few days were replaced by a quiet, grim certainty. When they woke the next morning, the air in the house on Sycamore Street was thick with unspoken finality. They didn't talk much over breakfast. There was nothing left to say, no more theories to debate. All that was left was the final act. They gathered their equipment, shovels, trowels, and the soil probe, and walked toward the woods for what they both knew would be the last time. They returned to the small hollow at the bottom of the ravine where the key had been unearthed. The spot was marked by the disturbed earth from the day before. This was their ground zero. They didn't bother with the metal detector now. This final stage was too delicate for that. Michael looked at the area, his experienced eyes assessing the flow of the land. The water would have pooled here, he said, his voice low and steady. The mudslide, the debris, it would have settled in this depression. They began to work, not with the frantic energy of a search, but with the painstaking care of archaeologists. They used the long, slender soil probe, pushing it gently into the earth every few inches, feeling for a change in density, listening for a sound that wasn't the hard, unforgiving scrape of rock. For hours, they worked in a focused silence, broken only by the soft thud of the probe, the whisper of the breeze in the trees, and their own steady breathing. It was Liam who found it. He pushed the probe into a patch of soft, dark soil near the base of an uprooted tree stump, and it stopped. But it wasn't the jarring halt of hitting stone. It was a dull, dense thud, a feeling of give that was somehow solid. He pushed again, a few inches to the left. The same feeling. He looked at Michael, and a silent, knowing glance passed between them. Liam set the probe aside and knelt, taking up the small hand trowel. He began to scrape away the top layer of soil and leaf litter. The earth was damp and cool. He worked slowly, peeling back the layers of a half-century. A few inches down, he uncovered a patch of what looked like rotted, dark blue fabric. Denim. Then, his trowel scraped against something metal. He carefully dug around it with his fingers and pulled it free. It was a simple, tarnished silver belt buckle, its design feminine and delicate. His breath caught in his throat. He looked at Michael, who was now kneeling opposite him, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Liam put the buckle gently on the ground beside him and continued to dig, now using only his hands, his fingers brushing the soil away with an almost reverent tenderness. And then he saw it. Unmistakable, undeniable, and profoundly sad. Protruding from the dark earth was the curved, pale shape of a bone. He stopped. Everything stopped. The sounds of the forest, the breeze, his own heartbeat, it all faded into a roaring silence. He had found her. The lost girl, the voice on the phone, was here. Right here, beneath his hands. He looked up at Michael. The older man's face was a canvas of emotions too deep and complex for words. 50 years of grief, of wondering, of guilt and regret, all culminating in this single, silent moment. He had found the end of his search, the source of his lifelong sorrow. Michael crawled forward on his knees and stopped just short of the site. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering in the air just above the ground, as if he could feel her presence there. He didn't cry. The emotion was too deep for tears. It was a quiet, soul-shattering communion. He was finally with her again. They stayed like that for a long time, two men from different generations keeping a silent, somber vigil over a makeshift grave. The woods felt sacred, a cathedral of silent trees bearing witness to a reunion that transcended time. Eventually, the reality of the situation began to settle in. Their private quest was over. Now, the world had to be let in. "We have to call them," Liam said softly, his voice feeling like a sacrilege in the hallowed quiet. Michael nodded, his gaze never leaving the spot. "Yes," he whispered. "It's time to bring her home." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. His hands were shaking, but his voice, when he spoke to the 911 dispatcher, was incredibly calm and clear. "My name is Michael Serrano," he said. "I'm in the woods off Sycamore Street with a friend. We have found human remains." There was a pause. "We believe it is Sarah Jenkins. She's been missing since 1978. After he ended the call, he didn't put the phone away. He sat back on his heels, his shoulders slumped, the tension of the last 50 years finally releasing its hold on him. He had done it. He had kept his unspoken promise. They didn't move from the spot. They waited, two guardians watching over a lost soul. They had done the impossible. They had followed a ghost's voice back to its source. After about 20 minutes, a faint, distant sound began to filter through the trees, a sound that didn't belong in the tranquil woods. It was the sound of sirens, growing steadily closer. The real world was coming to finally claim Sarah Jenkins and take her home. The long, lonely vigil was over. She was found. The arrival of the outside world was a jarring intrusion. The first to arrive were two uniformed patrol officers, their heavy boots crackling on the dry leaves, their expressions a mixture of professional caution and curiosity. They secured the area with a grim efficiency, their voices low and clipped on their radios. Liam and Michael were asked to step back, to move away from the site they had so painstakingly uncovered. Suddenly, they were outsiders, relegated to the role of witnesses at the edge of a scene that was no longer theirs. Soon, the quiet woods were filled with more people. A lead detective, a woman in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes who introduced herself as Detective Miller, arrived along with a team of forensic investigators in white coveralls. The sacred, silent space where they had communed with the past was transformed into a meticulously organized grid of police tape and evidence markers. Detective Miller approached them, her demeanor professional but not unkind. "You're the ones who called this in?" she asked, her gaze shifting between Liam and Michael. "I did," Michael said, his voice steady. "My name is Michael Serrano. This is Liam Carter." "And you believe the remains belong to Sarah Jenkins?" she asked, her pen poised over a small notebook. "We're certain of it," Michael replied. He then proceeded to explain, in a calm and measured tone, his connection to Sarah. He told her they had been close in college, that he had never stopped wondering what had happened to her. He explained Liam's role as a writer researching the cold case, a story Miller seemed to accept with a non-committal nod. "And how exactly," she asked, her eyes zeroing in on Liam, "did you two pinpoint this specific location when official searches 50 years ago found nothing?" This was the moment. They had to tell the story, the real story, but without the ghost. Liam took the lead, explaining his inheritance of the house on Sycamore Street and his subsequent deep dive into its history, which led him to Sarah's case. He told her about his visit with Evelyn Reed at the Historical Society, about learning of Hemlock's old towing company. He described their visit to George Hemlock's property and the discovery of the car. "The car was the key," Liam said. "We found a few of her personal effects inside, including a locket. But more importantly, it gave us a more precise location for where she went off the road. Previous searches focused on the road itself. We theorized she had tried to cut through the woods toward my house, got caught in the storm, and was washed into this ravine." He then explained how they had found the key, which had narrowed their search to this one small area. It was the complete, factual and logical truth, with only one miraculous detail, the phone call omitted. Detective Miller listened intently, her expression unreadable. She asked a few clarifying questions, but she didn't seem overtly skeptical. A 50-year-old cold case had just been solved by two determined civilians. The how was less important to her than the what. "We found her locket and her car key," Liam finished. "And a belt buckle. They're with her." Miller nodded. "That will help with the identification. We'll need to take your official statements down at the station, of course. But for now, you're free to go. We'll be in touch." There was one last piece of business. Michael reached into his bag and pulled out the waxed pouch containing the two letters. "We also found these in the glove compartment," he said, handing them to the detective. "They're personal. One was for her father. The other was for me." Miller took the letters, handling the fragile paper with care. She read the names on the front of the envelopes. This, more than anything else, seemed to solidify their story in her eyes. It provided the emotional context, the powerful human motive behind their obsessive search. "These are part of her story," she said, her professional tone softening slightly. "Once they're processed as part of the scene, I'll see to it that they're returned to you, Mr. Serrano." With that, their part in the official process was over. They turned and walked away, leaving the woods filled with the quiet, methodical work of the forensic team. As they emerged back into the sunlight of Liam's yard, the sounds of the investigation faded behind them. A profound sense of release washed over Liam. The weight of the secret, the burden of the search, it was no longer solely theirs to carry. Sarah was in the care of the world now. They spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet, emotional exhaustion. They gave their formal statements at the police station, a process that was little more than a repetition of the story they had told in the woods. By the time they returned to Sycamore Street, evening was falling. The house was peaceful, the black phone on its table now looking just like what it was, a harmless antique. They sat on the porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, just as Liam had done on his first nights in the house. It felt like a lifetime ago. The local news on the small radio in the kitchen was already reporting it. Human remains discovered in Havenwood Woods, believed to be linked to 1978 missing person case. Michael held the letters, which Detective Miller had, true to her word, returned to him before they left the station. He looked at the one addressed to Sarah's father. "Just one last thing to do," he said softly. "The Jenkins family has a plot in the Havenwood cemetery. Her parents are there, and there's a place for her." He looked at Liam, a deep, weary gratitude in his eyes. "We need to lay her to rest." The days that followed were a strange, quiet limbo. The outside world moved on with the official story, a cold case solved by a diligent researcher and a grieving friend. The Havenwood Chronicle ran a front-page story, a follow-up to the one from 1978, finally giving the town the end of the story. For Liam and Michael, however, it was a time of waiting. They waited for the coroner to officially identify and release Sarah's remains. It was a formality, but a necessary one. Michael, having proven his close connection, was recognized as the one to take responsibility for her final arrangements. They spent the time in the quiet house on Sycamore Street. The house itself felt different. The heavy, expectant silence that had always lingered in the corners was gone, replaced by a simple, peaceful quiet. It was no longer a house holding its breath. It was a house that had finally exhaled. It felt like just a house again, its ghosts laid to rest. They made the arrangements for the funeral. It was to be a small, private service. Michael didn't want a spectacle. He wanted a quiet, dignified farewell. He invited Evelyn Reed from the Historical Society, who had been so instrumental in the search. She accepted with a quiet, knowing grace, her eyes telling them she understood this was more than just the end of a cold case. The day of the burial was a crisp, clear autumn day. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the leaves on the trees in the Havenwood cemetery were a riot of gold and red. The air was still and cool. It felt like a day of peace. The Jenkins family plot was on a gentle slope overlooking a small pond. 2 weathered granite headstones marked the graves of Robert and Eleanor Jenkins. Between them was the 3rd, smaller stone, the one that had been waiting for 50 years. It simply read, Sarah Jenkins, born 1958, lost 1978, beloved daughter. There were only the 4 of them, Liam, Michael, Evelyn, and the funeral director. A small, simple casket sat before the empty grave. There were no grand pronouncements, no formal sermon. This was too personal for that. Michael stepped forward, clutching the 2 old, fragile letters in his hand. He looked down at the grave, and then out at the 2 friends who had helped him reach this final moment. I knew Sarah when we were barely 20 years old, he began, his voice clear and strong, though laden with a deep, resonant sadness. She was brilliant and funny, and she was going to be a journalist who told the world stories. She was fearless. The world lost a great light when it lost her. He paused, taking a breath. She was driving home that night to be with her family, to celebrate her father's birthday. She had a letter for him. He held up the first letter, and she was coming home to start a new life. A life that was tragically cut short before it could even begin. She was not lost alone that night. Liam knew what those words meant. It was Michael's quiet, public acknowledgement of the child he never knew, a secret shared now only with the wind and the sky. She had unfinished business, Michael continued, his gaze now fixed on the casket. Promises to keep, and truths to tell. It has taken 50 years, but those messages have been delivered. Her story can finally be finished. He knelt down and gently placed the 2 letters on top of the casket. The birthday letter for her father, and the final, secret letter for him. His delivery was, at long last, complete. This is for you, Sarah, he whispered. From your dad. And this is from me, finally answering you. I understand. And I love you. Goodbye. They stood in a respectful silence as the casket was lowered into the earth. The search, the calls, the mystery, it was all over. Sarah Jenkins, the lost girl from the storm, was finally home, at rest between the parents she had been fighting so hard to reach. A profound sense of peace settled over the small group, a feeling of a great and terrible weight finally being lifted. Later that afternoon, back at the house, Michael finished packing his small bag. He was flying back to Texas the next morning. He would go home to his own family, to his children and grandchildren, and for the first time, he would be able to tell them the whole story. Before he left the living room, he walked over to the black rotary phone one last time. He reached out and placed his hand on the cool, silent receiver. He looked at Liam, a lifetime of gratitude in his eyes. You're a good man, Liam Carter, he said. You listened when no one else could hear. He looked back at the phone. Tell her thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. For not giving up. The phone, of course, remained silent. It had no more stories to tell, no more desperate calls to make from out of the storm. Its job was done. The line was quiet. The house was at peace. And in a small cemetery on a hill, a family was finally reunited, their beloved daughter home at last. Michael flew back to Texas the next day. They shook hands at the airport, a simple gesture that felt deeply inadequate for the profound, life-altering journey they had shared. There were no grand pronouncements of eternal friendship, but a quiet, solid understanding passed between them. They were 2 men bound by a ghost, and that was a bond that needed no words. Life in Havenwood settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The autumn leaves fell from the sycamore tree, blanketing the lawn in a carpet of gold and crimson, and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter. The story of Sarah Jenkins's discovery faded from the local news, becoming what it was always meant to be, a piece of town history, a tragedy with a final, somber chapter. Liam returned to his work, the familiar process of cleaning and balancing audio frequencies feeling more meaningful than ever before. He was, after all, in the business of finding clarity in the noise, of making sure a voice could be heard. His work felt different, and so did the house. The old Victorian no longer felt haunted or expectant. It was simply his home, its creaks and groans the comforting sounds of an old friend settling in for a long winter's nap. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by a warmth and a sense of belonging Liam hadn't realized was missing. A few weeks after the funeral, he received an email from Michael. It was long and thoughtful. He wrote about how telling his family the full story had been difficult, but ultimately liberating. His children and grandchildren now understood the source of a sadness he had carried his whole life. He was grieving, he wrote, but for the first time, he was grieving properly, for the vibrant young woman and the child he now knew he had lost. At the end of the email, he mentioned something else. He had used a portion of his retirement savings to establish a scholarship in Sarah's name at Northgate University. The Sarah Jenkins Memorial Scholarship would be awarded each year to a promising female student majoring in journalism. Her dream of telling the world stories would now, in a way, live on through others. Liam found himself smiling, a deep sense of rightness settling in his chest. It was the perfect tribute. One afternoon, he drove into town and stopped by the Historical Society. He found Evelyn Reed exactly where he expected her to be, meticulously cataloging old town photographs. He'd brought 2 cups of coffee. She accepted one with a grateful smile. "The whole town feels a little lighter, you know," she said, looking at him over the rim of her cup. "That story was like a loose thread in the fabric of Havenwood for 50 years. You and Mr. Serrano, you finally tied the knot." She never asked for the details, never pried into how they'd really found Sarah. She was a woman who respected that some stories are best left in the quiet places where they're found. On his way home, on a whim, Liam took the long way around, driving out along the country roads that led towards the Hemlock property. He stopped and left a good bottle of bourbon on the gatepost next to the "No Trespassing" sign, with a simple handwritten note that just said, "Thank you." He didn't know if George Hemlock would see it or care, but it felt like closing the final circle. That evening, as the first few delicate snowflakes of the season began to drift down outside his window, Liam stood in his living room, looking at the black rotary phone. It sat on its table, an object of silent, profound history. For a time, it had been a conduit to another world, a lifeline for a lost soul. Now, it was just a phone. A beautiful, archaic piece of machinery that held the memory of a miracle. He ran his hand over its smooth, cool surface. He could put it back in the attic, hide it away. But he knew he wouldn't. It belonged right here. It was a monument to listening. A reminder that the most important signals are not always the loudest, and that every voice deserves to be heard, no matter how long it takes to find its way through the static. He sat on his porch, wrapped in a warm jacket, and watched the snow begin to coat the bare branches of the sycamore tree. The world was growing quiet, settling down for a long rest. The house behind him was warm and peaceful. The lost were found, the grieving were healing, and a 50-year-old promise had finally been kept. The phone call from a number that doesn't exist had been answered, and now, at last, the line was silent. 5 years. It felt like both a lifetime and the blink of an eye. 5 winters had blanketed the lawn on Sycamore Street in snow, and 5 autumns had set the great tree ablaze in fiery color. The house was no longer a new inheritance filled with the ghosts of the past. It was home, every creak and groan as familiar and comforting to Liam as his own heartbeat. His freelance audio business had blossomed into a full-fledged recording studio, Havenwood Sound, which he ran out of the converted carriage house in the back. The old Victorian, once a place of silent, watchful mystery, was now frequently filled with the sounds of local musicians, of creativity, and of life. The black rotary phone still sat in its place of honor in the living room. It was a conversation piece now. Clients and friends would comment on the beautiful antique, and Liam would simply smile and say it had been in the family for a long time. It was his silent monument, a reminder of the incredible journey that had anchored him to this town and to a past that wasn't his own. Once a year, in the crisp air of late October, Michael Serrano would fly in from Austin. It had become their quiet tradition. It wasn't a pilgrimage of grief, but one of remembrance and gratitude. A friendship forged in the crucible of a 50-year-old tragedy had become one of the most steadfast and important of Liam's life. On this 5th anniversary, they stood together in the Havenwood Cemetery. The sky was a pale, soft gray, and a gentle breeze rustled the remaining leaves on the trees. Sarah's grave was peaceful, the simple stone now weathered slightly, looking as if it had always been there, nestled between her parents. Michael placed a small bouquet of yellow roses at its base. "I got a letter last week," Michael said, breaking the comfortable silence. "From this year's scholarship recipient. A young woman named Chloe. She's the editor of the campus paper now. She said Sarah's story is what inspired her to become a journalist. She wants to tell the stories that get forgotten." He smiled, a sad but deeply proud expression on his face. "She's doing it, Liam. Sarah's still telling the world's stories." They stood there for a while longer, 2 friends sharing a moment of quiet reflection. The raw, jagged edges of the tragedy had softened over the years, leaving behind not a wound, but a profound and lasting sense of connection. Sarah was no longer a restless spirit, but a cherished memory, her legacy now a living, breathing thing in the world. Later that day, back at the house, they shared a glass of bourbon in Liam's studio. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Michael looked around at the mix of vintage and modern recording equipment, his professional eye appreciating the setup. "You've built something special here," he said. "This house was a good place to start," Liam replied, his eyes drifting towards the main house, towards the living room where the phone sat. "It chose the right person," Michael said, raising his glass in a silent toast. "It needed someone who knew how to listen." He paused, a thoughtful look on his face. "Do you ever wonder if it will ring again?" Liam had thought about it over the years. In the dead of night, he would sometimes hear a phantom ring in his memory, but the phone itself had remained blessedly, peacefully silent. "No," he said with a sense of certainty. "I think its job is done." The call was answered. Michael left the next morning. After dropping him at the airport, Liam stopped at a downtown estate sale he'd seen advertised. He had a weakness for old audio equipment, and he'd spotted something in the photos online. He came home with a dusty but well-preserved reel-to-reel tape machine from the 1960s. He spent the afternoon in his studio, carefully cleaning the tape heads and lubricating the moving parts. Curious to see if it worked, he threaded the old, unlabeled reel of tape that had come with it onto the machine. He switched it on. The reels began to turn slowly, and a low hiss emanated from his studio monitors. He adjusted the volume, expecting to hear the faint, tinny sound of old music. Instead, through the dense, 50-year-old tape hiss, a voice emerged. It was faint, laced with the crackle of age and magnetic decay. It was a young man's voice, speaking in a hurried, panicked whisper. "If anyone finds this," the voice said, the words distorted and wavering, "tell them I'm sorry. I never meant to. The lighthouse. The light went out." Suddenly, the tape made a sharp snapping sound and the reels stopped turning. The old magnetic tape, brittle with age, had broken. Silence filled the studio. Liam sat perfectly still, his heart not pounding with fear, but with a slow, deep sense of wonder. He stared at the silent machine. It was just an old recording, a random, forgotten message on a discarded piece of tape. It was nothing. And yet, he looked out the window, towards the quiet, peaceful town of Havenwood, a place full of forgotten corners and untold stories. The story of Sarah Jenkins was over. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the world was full of weak signals, of faint voices lost in the static, just waiting for someone to stop and to listen. And his work had just begun. The silence that followed the snap of the old tape was absolute. Liam sat frozen in his studio chair, his gaze fixed on the motionless reels. The fragmented voice echoed in the room, a ghost not in the machine, but on the thin, brittle ribbon of magnetism. "The lighthouse. The light went out." His first reaction wasn't fear, not anymore. The events of the past 5 years had rewired his soul, tuning him to a different frequency. What he felt was a profound and sudden curiosity, a familiar pull towards a story that had been lost to time. He looked over at the wall separating the studio from the main house, in the direction of the silent, black rotary phone. It was one thing to be the recipient of a direct, supernatural call. It was another entirely to stumble upon a message in a bottle, a random whisper caught by chance on a piece of discarded technology. With the steady hands of a surgeon, he carefully unthreaded the broken tape. The break was clean, a simple fracture from age and tension. Splicing tape was an old-fashioned skill, a relic from the analog age, but it was one he had learned. He meticulously trimmed the broken ends, applied the splicing tape, and pressed the two pieces together, healing the 50-year-old wound. He rethreaded the reel and, instead of just playing it, he fed the audio directly into his computer, digitizing the entire, fragile recording. He didn't want to risk another break. Once the short audio snippet was a stable waveform on his screen, he got to work. He applied noise reduction filters, carefully stripping away the layers of hiss and crackle. He isolated the frequency of the young man's voice, amplifying it, bringing it from a distant whisper into a clear, though still haunting, message. He listened to the cleaned-up version a dozen times. The panic in the voice was palpable. There were other sounds in the background, too, faint but present. A low, mournful moan that could be a foghorn, and a percussive, chaotic roar that sounded like wind and crashing waves. This was no quiet forest. This was the sound of a violent storm on the coast. Havenwood was a landlocked town, hours from the nearest ocean. There were no lighthouses here. The tape had come from the estate of a local family, the Parkers. The connection felt tenuous, almost non-existent. Liam leaned back, staring at the waveform on his screen. He could let it go. It was a fascinating, spooky coincidence. A piece of audio flotsam from a bygone era. He could archive the file and move on with his quiet, peaceful life. But the voice. The apology. Tell them I'm sorry. It was the sound of unfinished business. The same sound he had heard in the static-laced calls from Sarah Jenkins. He knew he couldn't ignore it. The next morning, he found himself walking up the steps of the Havenwood Historical Society, a box of donuts in hand for Evelyn Reed. She was, as always, a beacon of calm, historical certainty. "Liam," she greeted him warmly. "To what do I owe the pleasure? And are those maple glazed?" He smiled, setting the box on her desk. "They are. Evelyn, I have a strange question. It's about the Parker estate sale." "Ah, yes," she said, her eyes lighting up with the thrill of a historical query. "The Parkers have been in Havenwood since the beginning. A sad end to the line, with old Mr. Parker passing. I bought some old audio equipment from the sale," Liam explained. "And I found a recording on it. A strange one. It mentions a lighthouse. I know it's a long shot, but did the Parker family have any connection to the coast?" Evelyn's brow furrowed in thought. She took a slow sip of her tea. "The coast. Yes, of course," she said, her memory clicking into place. "It wasn't Mr. Parker, the one who just passed. It was his younger brother, Daniel. Oh, this was a long time ago, back in the late 60s. Daniel was the wild one, the adventurer. He didn't want to stay in Havenwood. The summer after his freshman year of college, he took a job way out on the coast. Said he wanted to write a novel. He was working as an assistant keeper at a lighthouse." A chill traced its way down Liam's spine. What happened to him? Evelyn's expression grew somber. It was a terrible tragedy. There was a huge storm that autumn, one of the worst on record. Daniel disappeared. They said he was likely swept off the rocks while trying to secure the storm shutters. They never found him. She paused, her eyes distant. The worst part of it, the detail that always haunted the family, was that the lighthouse beacon failed that night, right in the middle of the storm. Several fishing boats ran into trouble. It was a whole mess. The lighthouse, the light went out. The words from the tape slammed into Liam with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a random recording. It was a final message. Daniel Parker's last words. "Evelyn," Liam said, his voice tight with a new urgency. "Do you remember the name of the lighthouse?" She thought for a moment. It was a strange name. Something dramatic. Point Remorse. Yes, that was it. The Point Remorse Lighthouse. Liam stood in the quiet, dusty archives of the Historical Society, the story of another lost soul laid bare before him. This wasn't an accident he had stumbled upon. It was an echo. The universe, it seemed, had his number. He had proven he was willing to listen, and another call was coming through. It wasn't on a phone line this time, but on a fragile strip of magnetic tape. He had a name, Daniel Parker. He had a place, Point Remorse. And he had a final, cryptic message. "Tell them I'm sorry." Was Daniel apologizing for his own accidental death? Or was he apologizing for the light, the one he was supposed to be tending, going out on the worst possible night? A new journey, into a new storm, was about to begin. Liam walked out of the Historical Society into the cool afternoon air, his mind a whirlwind. The world, which had felt so settled and peaceful just an hour before, was suddenly crackling with the static of a new, unsolved mystery. He drove home in a daze, the story of Daniel Parker, the young lighthouse keeper, replaying in his head. A wild one, an adventurer, a writer. A boy who vanished in a storm on the same night the light he was sworn to protect went out. Back in the quiet of his studio, he played the digitized audio clip again. This time, Daniel's voice was not just a random ghost on a wire. It had a name, a face Liam could imagine, and a story. The panicked whisper, the sounds of the storm, the mournful foghorn. It was a snapshot of the last terrifying moments of a young man's life. The apology, "Tell them I'm sorry," now carried the immense weight of a failed duty and a town's tragedy. There was no question of letting it go. The same sense of profound responsibility that had compelled him to answer Sarah's calls now demanded that he listen to Daniel's last words. He had been chosen, for a second time, to be a custodian of a lost story. His quiet, peaceful life would have to wait. He spent the next several hours diving into a digital rabbit hole. His first search was for Point Remorse Lighthouse. He discovered it was a real place, perched on a desolate rocky strip of coastline about a 4-hour drive from Havenwood. As Evelyn had suggested, it had been decommissioned in the mid-1970s when modern GPS navigation made it obsolete. It wasn't a museum or a tourist attraction. It was now under the jurisdiction of the State Park Service, but it was listed as abandoned and not accessible to the public due to its deteriorating condition. The photos he found showed a stark, beautiful, and lonely structure, a white tower against a backdrop of gray, churning sea and jagged black rocks. Next, he searched for newspaper archives from the autumn of 1969, looking for mention of the storm. He found several articles from coastal papers. They called it a nor'easter of the decade, a brutal storm that had grounded ships and battered the coastline for 2 straight days. One article mentioned the failure of the Point Remorse light, and the subsequent trouble it caused for a small fishing fleet trying to find its way back to harbor. Tucked at the end of the article was a single tragic paragraph. Authorities have also called off the search for 19-year-old Daniel Parker, the assistant lightkeeper at Point Remorse, who is presumed to have been swept to his death during the storm. It was ruled an accident, a footnote in a larger story of the storm's fury. The official story was neat and tidy, but it didn't account for the recording Liam had in his possession. It didn't account for the apology. Before he started making travel plans, he picked up the phone and called the one person he knew would understand. "Liam, good to hear from you," Michael Serrano's warm voice answered from Texas. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Michael," Liam said. "More than fine. Something's happened. Something strange. I think I may have found another one." He explained the story, from the estate sale and the reel-to-reel player to the cryptic message and what he had learned from Evelyn. He told him about Daniel Parker and the Point Remorse lighthouse. Michael listened patiently, without interruption. When Liam was finished, there was a long pause on the line. "Well," Michael said, his voice a mixture of awe and concern, "I'll be damned. It seems you're the one these stories choose, Liam. Like a radio receiver tuned to a station no one else can hear." He sighed. "What are you going to do?" "I have to go there," Liam said. "I have to see the lighthouse. I don't know what I'm looking for, but I know I have to look." "I understand," Michael said. "Just be careful." Sarah's story was a tragedy of circumstance. This one, a light going out, an apology, it feels different. It feels like it might have sharper edges. Keep your wits about you. The drive to the coast the next day was a steady transformation of the landscape. The familiar rolling hills and dense forests of Havenwood gradually flattened into marshlands and then sandy, wind-swept plains. The air began to taste of salt. It was late afternoon when he finally saw it. He crested a small hill on the coastal highway, and there it was in the distance. Point Remorse Lighthouse. It stood on the furthest edge of a long, rocky finger of land, a solitary white needle pointing at a vast, gray sky. Even from miles away, it radiated an aura of profound loneliness. He checked into a small weathered motel in the sleepy fishing town of Port Blossom, the closest settlement to the old lighthouse. The air was heavy with mist and the constant, rhythmic sound of the surf. This was Daniel Parker's world. This was the place he had come to seek adventure, and the place he had met his end. As dusk began to settle, Liam drove out to the access road for the state park. A heavy chain blocked the road, accompanied by a faded sign warning against trespassing. He parked the car and walked to the edge of the overlook. The lighthouse stood before him, about a mile down the point, silhouetted against the dying light. The tower was dark, its great lantern room empty and lifeless. It looked like a tombstone. He felt a deep, resonant sadness emanating from it, the final, lonely echo of a boy's last words, trapped on a loop of wind and memory. He was here, and tomorrow, he would find a way to get closer. The search for Daniel Parker had begun. The dawn in Port Blossom broke not with light, but with a slow, gray dilution of the darkness. A thick blanket of sea mist shrouded the town, muffling the sound of the distant foghorn and the cry of the gulls. It was the kind of weather that felt ancient and full of secrets. For Liam, it was the perfect atmosphere to go hunting for a ghost. He bypassed the chained access road, choosing instead to walk the coastline. It was a rugged, treacherous mile. The path was a barely there trail winding between jagged black rocks, slick with mist and sea spray. The constant, thunderous roar of the surf crashing against the shore was a powerful, intimidating sound. Liam imagined young Daniel Parker, an adventurous boy from a landlocked town, walking the same path, feeling the raw, untamed power of the ocean for the first time. He imagined him here on the night of the storm, the roar becoming a deafening, monstrous scream. After a 30-minute trek, he was there, standing at the base of the Point Remorse lighthouse. Up close, it was even more imposing and derelict. The white paint was peeling in long strips, revealing the dark, weathered stone beneath. Rust stains bled down from every iron fixture. The keeper's cottage attached to the base of the tower was in even worse shape, its windows boarded up and a section of its roof caved in. Liam circled the structure, his boots crunching on the gravel. The main door to the tower was a solid slab of iron, secured with a heavy, rusted padlock that looked as if it hadn't been opened since the 1970s. Getting in that way was impossible. He turned his attention to the cottage. One of the boards over a side window was loose, rotted through by decades of salty air. With a bit of effort, he was able to pry it free, revealing a dark, gaping hole. He hoisted himself up and through the opening, dropping down into a small, dilapidated room. The air inside was thick with the smell of mold, salt, and decay. Dust lay like a fine gray snow on everything. He could make out the shapes of old furniture shrouded in white cloths, silent, lumpy ghosts in the gloom. A doorway at the back of the room led, as he had hoped, into the base of the lighthouse tower itself. Stepping into the tower was like stepping into the belly of a stone beast. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the faint, high-pitched whistle of the wind through the cracks in the lantern room far above. A magnificent, cast-iron spiral staircase dominated the space, winding its way up into the darkness. Liam began to climb. His footsteps echoed on the metal stairs, a lonely, rhythmic clang in the immense silence. Small, slit-like windows appeared at each landing, offering slivers of the gray, churning sea. The higher he climbed, the louder the wind became, a mournful howl that seemed to seep through the very stones of the tower. He was ascending into the heart of the storm. Finally, he reached the top. He pushed open a heavy iron trapdoor and emerged into the lantern room. It was a circular space, enclosed entirely in thick glass panels, offering a stunning, dizzying 360-degree view of the violent sea and the treacherous point. In the center of the room stood the heart of the lighthouse, the massive, intricate Fresnel lens and the lamp housing, now dark and covered in a thick layer of dust. This was Daniel's post. This was where he had faced the storm. Liam walked a slow circle around the room, his fingers tracing lines in the dust on the glass. He imagined Daniel up here, the wind shrieking, the waves exploding against the rocks below, the great lamp turning and casting its life-saving beam into the tempest. He tried to picture the moment of panic, the moment the light went out. He examined the lamp mechanism. It was a complex piece of machinery, but nothing looked obviously broken from his vantage point. He knelt to get a closer look at the base of the housing, and that's when he saw it. Scratched crudely into the dusty iron floor, almost hidden beneath the pedestal, was a single word, Lockwood. It wasn't elegant or old. It looked like it had been carved hastily, with a nail or a screwdriver. Lockwood. What did it mean? A name? A place? It was a tangible clue, a message left behind in the eye of the storm. He took a photo of the scratching with his phone, his mind racing. This changed everything. This wasn't the mark of an accident. This was intentional. A message. He made his way back down the spiral stairs, the name Lockwood echoing in his mind. As he dropped back out of the broken cottage window onto the gravel below, a voice startled him. Find what you were looking for? Liam spun around. An old man stood about 20 feet away, leaning on a gnarled piece of driftwood he was using as a walking stick. He was weathered as the rocks themselves, with a thick white beard and sharp, clear blue eyes. He wore a heavy wool sweater and a watch cap, and he was looking at Liam not with anger, but with a kind of weary, knowing curiosity. This is private property, the old man said, his voice a gravelly rumble. I know, Liam said, deciding honesty was the best approach. I'm sorry. I'm a researcher. I'm looking into an old story about this place. About a young man who disappeared here a long time ago. Daniel Parker. The old man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of a long-dormant memory in their depths. Danny Parker, he said, the name tasting strange in his mouth after so long. Haven't heard that name in 50 years. What's a man from inland want with a sad old story like that? He took a step closer, his gaze sharp and intelligent. What are you really looking for up there?